All right, I see people are still filing in, but it is after 1 and we have a pretty tight schedule, so I'm going to not reinforce tardy behavior and go ahead and get us started. So really great to see everyone. Welcome. Welcome to Harvest Day 2020. My name is Matt Knock. I'm the department chair and I will be the moderator for today's meeting. And I wanted to start out by saying how excited I am. Harvest Day is one of my favorite days of the year, second only behind second year project talk day. This is the day where our department comes together to learn about the exciting work happening over the past year in the roughly 30 labs in our department. So a lot to hear about today. As you know, a lot has changed over the past year. Some question, should we have Harvest Day this year given the pandemic, rampant racial injustice, economic stress, elevated mental health challenges that many of us are experiencing as a result of these things? As you now see, we're having it. And I personally think it's important that we have it and continue as full steam as possible for at least 2 reasons. One is related to the content of our work. The contributions of psychological science are arguably more important now than ever. And as we'll hear about today, researchers in our department are focused on advancing our understanding of key factors that are affecting our society through all of this, such as how children develop, how our basic cognitive functioning is operating, how we interact with others and resolve conflict in social groups, and how we can best monitor and improve our mental health. So we need this work to continue and are excited to hear about it today. The second relates to the process of how we work. We really have to maintain this community. We have to stay connected, we have to come together, we have to reach out, we have to support each other, we have to take care of ourselves. And so for all of these reasons, I'm really, really glad that we have such a full list of speakers today and that there's so many people in attendance. It's great to see all of you, and I look forward to today's meeting and to continued connection over the course of this semester and this year. So our schedule is packed, and so let's get started. Before we do, I want to say a special thanks to Krista Lester and her team, and especially to Casey Kruger and Joan Smeltzer for all of their absolutely amazing work, as usual, organizing every aspect of today's meeting. My main goal is to not mess any of it up. Each of our 14 speakers have 10 minutes for their presentation and Q&A. So for instance, speakers, if you speak for 7 minutes, there's 3 minutes for Q&A. If you speak for 10 minutes, no questions for you. And I apologize in advance, I will play the role of bad cop, and so I want to really keep us on schedule to respect everyone's time. In terms of everyone in the audience, very excited that you're here and looking forward to hear your comments and questions. Procedurally, I would ask that you just keep yourselves muted when not speaking. And when each speaker ends their presentation, raise a blue hand and we will call on you. If you have a question and don't want to say it, you can type it into the chat box. We just ask that you do not type questions into the chat box publicly or raise hands during the presentations. It can be distracting to presenters and to the audience. So we ask that you hold your questions, comments until the end of each talk. If we are not able to call on you for a question, I apologize for that in advance. Please do reach out to the presenters. I know that faculty love hearing from each other and from students and staff and everyone else in attendance with questions, comments, connections, anything you want to share. I'm sure the presenters would be happy to hear it. So with that, I will stop talking and start our series off. So let's get started. The first speaker up today is Professor Talia Kunkel.
All right, there we go. Let me share screen. All right. Is everyone able to see my screen and hear my voice? Awesome. All right, here we go. Harvest Day tradition is to report on the progress of the past calendar year. And I'm happy to do so today on behalf of the Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Committee in our department. In November 2019, the Diversity Committee, as it was then called, was formed when, upon realizing Jim Sedanius would be retiring at some nearing point in time, 6 of us volunteered to work on identifying faculty of color to recruit to our department. A few email conversations, a meeting, and some exchanges happened at a relatively slow clip over the fall and into the spring. But as everyone knows, the events of late spring and early summer changed everything. Of particular importance for our committee was June 10th, 2020, the day we shut down academia and held a town hall to discuss as a community issues of race and diversity in our department. And it's fair to say that since that meeting, our committee has transformed. We started sprinting, and over the summer, we've settled into a steady bi-weekly meeting step without pause since that day. We now have 28 members in Stride. There are two main things that I learned at the town hall. Actually, that's a narrative trick. There are dozens of things I learned, but 10 minutes, people. The first is that I had a misconception. I thought that the key to diversity was recruitment. But what I didn't realize was that recruiting efforts to bring more diverse perspectives in must be met hand in hand with an internal climate and internal systems to support them. And at this point, the committee changed from the Diversity Committee to the Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Committee, and the baton was passed from the Climate Committee to us. The second thing I learned from the town hall was that I didn't know a lot of things. When I started to dig in to what was said, for instance, I learned that there's a difference between trying to be not racist and trying to be anti-racist, which relates to how I conceived of racism in the first place. And it made me have to process the fact that no part of my education had exposed me to this alternative conceptual structure until now. For many of us in the Zoom gallery here, the end of the summer was a time where we learned a lot. Small reading groups were formed, new diversity Slack channels were made, and our committee helped a few people join and form groups of their own. But certainly, this learning is not just work of a summer, but work of a lifetime. So to continue this conversation, following a DIB committee proposal, the faculty have voted to have an annual lecture on issues of diversity, inclusion, and social inequality as a regular part of our colloquium series. And in an email-based asynchronous faculty vote that just finished under the wire and is news even to the DIB committee as well, I'm thrilled to report that on the advent of his retirement, this lecture will be named the annual Jim Sedanius Lecture on issues of diversity, inclusion, and social inequality. So the town hall and the climate survey clarified much work to be done. How to proceed. Over 20 people gathered, buzzing with energy. We talked about what we were passionate about and what was important to us. And then, in a self-organizing and thrilling burst, things started happening at many scales, scopes, and in many directions, all at the same time. Our collective efforts seemed generally to organize around three goals: outward-facing recruitment initiatives to bring people into our department, inward-facing climate initiatives to make our department a supportive and welcoming place where everyone can thrive, and system-level initiatives that examine our policies and practices for how people enter in and advance through our department. Each of these goals is made concrete and actionable by considering the needs of different groups at different career stages: faculty and staff, postdocs, graduate students, and undergrad research assistants, as well as the community as a whole. And I can genuinely say that across all the members, there is someone, usually a group of people, working on initiatives that touch each cell of this DIB matrix. To highlight just a few of these, one immediate and ongoing initiative is an outward-facing community-level effort to change our website from being a wall to being a portal. We have a diversity statement, and we're working to make a clearer show of who we are and what it would be like to work here for people who don't already have a network to let them know. At the graduate level, we're conducting an audit of our application process and a quantitative analysis of our previous applications. And we're launching a large-scale recruiting and informational event called PPREP. PPREP is an informational event geared towards students from underrepresented minority backgrounds who are applying to graduate schools and research assistant positions. It will be held next month on a weekend. Everyone here is welcome to attend. And following that week, there'll be time for each participant to get some feedback on their CV, their research statement, and maybe to have a conversation with a Harvard student, faculty, or alum. And one of the most exciting things to share is that as of yesterday, we have 1,646 individuals who want to participate in this program. This is a whole generation of young URM scholars interested in psychology. And we have over 100 of us in the community who have volunteered to be mentors during that week. If you're potentially interested but are hesitating, reach out to the committee to learn more. The number of applicants we could admit depends on us. Of course, there's more we're doing and have done, and it somewhat pains me that I don't have time to tell you all about it, but my solace is that maybe it's not important that everyone knows everything all the time. So I hope that some of our work touches your spheres, that handout in your G1 orientation about the different contact people to go to, the lab manager listserv that lets people connect to see how other labs are doing things administratively. And if there's something specific you're wondering about and you have some bandwidth to give, we actually have a group of people on our committee who are tasked with supporting you and coordinating community actions with committee initiatives. And in fact, this is already happening. We're supporting a peer advising program that's underway this semester, run by students not on the committee. And we're supporting the first stages of designing a bridge to PhD program run by faculty not on the committee. And we also have a community on-call list, which is a list of you interested in being contacted with DIB-related opportunities as they arise. And this has already come in handy several times. So here's your committee this semester. We attempted to make a broad-ranging group from all areas spanning career stages. Take a look and see if you can find someone that you know and would feel comfortable just reaching out to. And if there isn't someone that you feel comfortable doing that with, then reach out to me, because we need to know where our blind spots are. We are privileged to have 3 outstanding diversity fellows who help interface our committee with the growing diversity, inclusion, and belonging infrastructure at Harvard. And I asked them what they thought the most important thing to emphasize in this Harvest Day talk was. And I'd like to paraphrase Osiris Rankin, who has a certain way of putting things. He said, "The biggest theme for me is that we are in progress. I think that in some ways our department already had impressive diversity at the graduate and undergraduate levels. However, we've had sustained issues with inclusion, belonging, and equity, even at levels where our numerical diversity was relatively high. And at the faculty level, the issues of diversity are striking. We needed to act. The ways that people have joined in, particularly with P-Prep, is encouraging. Ideas have turned into actions over a few seasons. For me, that's the fruit of the harvest." So with that, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll report back in 2021. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Talia, for that amazing presentation and update. We have time for one question, if there is one that someone wants to ask. Okay, seeing no blue hands or questions in the chat box. Thank you so much, Talia. Wonderful job, and thank you so much to the DIB committee for all of the amazing work you're doing. All right, our next speaker is going to be Stephen Pinker.
Thank you. Is my screen shared? Very good. Thank you, Matt. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to speak at Harvest Day, also my favorite event of the year. I'm going to speak about some ideas that grew not out of my lab, but out of a course I taught in the spring, Gen Ed 1066, Rationality, the Nature of Rationality, the Cognitive Science of Rationality, Rationality in the World. And I'll share with you one of the classroom demos that we did. First, I want to acknowledge the enormous help that I got in planning and administering the course from 2 graduate students, Maddie Toma in economics and Jason Nimro here in psychology. So here's a demo. It involves forecasting events in the world. How likely do you think it is that the following events will take place in this decade, 2020 to 2030? Saudi Arabia develops a nuclear weapon. Nicolas Maduro resigns as president of Venezuela. Russia has a female president. The world suffers a new and even more lethal pandemic. Vladimir Putin is constitutionally prevented from running for another term as president of Russia, and his wife takes his place on the ballot, allowing him to run the country from the sidelines. Massive strikes and riots forced Nicolas Maduro to resign as president of Venezuela. A respiratory virus jumps from bats to humans in China and starts a new and even more lethal pandemic. After Iran develops a nuclear weapon and tests it in an underground explosion, Saudi Arabia develops its own nuclear weapon in response. Now, Julian De Freitas and I turned this classroom demo into an online survey, and what we found, similar to the results I got in the class, that among 400 Mechanical Turk respondents, on average, people judged that it was likelier that Putin's wife will be president of Russia than that a woman will be president of Russia. It was likelier that strikes will force Maduro to resign than that he will resign. Saudi Arabia is likelier to develop a nuclear weapon in response to an Iranian bomb than it is to develop a nuclear weapon. And it is likelier that Chinese bats will start a pandemic than that there will be a pandemic. Now, you should all recognize that this is an example of the conjunction fallacy, as it's called in cognitive psychology. People judge the probability of a conjunction of events, A and B, as likelier than the probability of a single event. It's a fallacy because, of course, a subset, such as A and B, must be smaller than the superset, and therefore the set of events have to be less likely. It has to be less likely that Maduro resigns after massive strikes and protests than that he resigns in general, because there could be other reasons that he resigns. We found this even within participant comparisons, same people judging the two events. 86% of the respondents committed the conjunction fallacy for at least one item, 99% if you include ties where the probability of A and B is equal to the probability of A. The conjunction fallacy, of course, was discovered 40 years ago by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in the famous Linda problem. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Putting aside the somewhat antique baby boomer name Linda and the passé cause of anti-nuclear demonstrations, the result still obtains today. What is the probability that Linda is a bank teller? What is the probability that Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement? And the majority of people then and now think it's likelier that Linda is a feminist bank teller than that she is a bank teller. Conjunction fallacy. Tversky and Kahneman explained it in terms of the representativeness heuristic, that people judge the probability that an item belongs to a category according to how representative the item is, that is, how close it is to a prototype or stereotype of the category. And it is possible that an individual, like Linda, can be more prototypical of a conjunction, feminist bank teller, than one of its conjuncts, a bank teller. Now, the conjunction fallacy and the representativeness heuristic belong to a growing list of cognitive biases and fallacies. The Wikipedia entry for cognitive biases lists 200 of them, from ambiguity effect and anchoring, all the way down to the women are wonderful effect, the zero risk bias, and the zero sum bias. So there's lots of fun stuff to teach. I'm sure many of you have taught this in your courses. My own rationality course, after I put the lectures online, developed a substantial audience worldwide, and people from various walks of life encouraged me to turn the course into a book, and that will be my next major project. Rationality, what it is, why it's scarce, why it matters. Now, in grappling with the subject matter of rationality, both for the course and the book, a number of puzzles arose. Does human judgment and decision-making really consist of a long list of illusions, fallacies, biases, blind spots, aversions, neglects, and fundamental errors? There are a number of books on the market that present our minds in this way, but it raises the question, with all those fallacies and biases, how can we be so smart? How did we even invent the benchmarks of rationality against which we compare human performance and find it wanting? How can the same species produce a John von Neumann and an Alfred E. Newman? And this was a focus of the course. It will be a focus of the book. A second focus is, what are the tools of rationality, the normative models against which we compare typical human performance, and that many of us feel every educated person should command? I'm sure I'm not the only person in this department who has had the thought, gee, Bayesian reasoning, signal detection theory, correlation and causation, the ideas that we deal with in our science are really things that every educated person should master, that high schools should get rid of trigonometry, which is useless, and teach kids Bayes' theorem and signal detection theory. So in the course and in the book, I came up with what I thought were the 8 major tools that I think that every educated person should master, but that have never been presented before between 2 covers. If any of you have alternative suggestions, I'd love to hear them. But I think they would be logic, critical thinking, probability and chance, Bayesian reasoning, statistical decision theory or signal detection theory, closely related, rational choice or expected utility theory, game theory, and correlation and causation. Finally, the most frequently asked question that I got when I told people I was teaching a course on rationality, and now when I say I'm writing a book on rationality, is, why do people believe such weird things? How is it that in an era of unprecedented resources for rationality, we have so much fake news, conspiracy theories, quack cures, and post-truth rhetoric? How can intelligent people believe that Hillary Clinton ran a child sex ring out of a DC pizzeria? Or that jet contrails are really tranquilizing drugs dispersed under a secret government program to pacify the population? Or that wind farms cause cancer, to pick just one of the beliefs endorsed by our commander-in-chief. Now, these people in other ways are rational. They can get dressed, they can find their way to work, they can fill out their income taxes. How at the same time can they believe such wacky delusions? And what I found was that the standard content of a judgment and decision-making curriculum, base rate neglect, gambler's fallacy, are not of much help in answering this frequently asked question. So let me just share a hypothesis that I plan to develop in the book and that I broached in the course, which is, it depends what you mean by belief. I believe that there are 2 modes of belief, cognitively speaking. There's a reality mindset, which we apply to the local, everyday, tangible world, where we embrace statements because they are true, because if we embraced false statements, we'd get into a lot of trouble. But then there's the mythology mindset, which we apply to the remote, unknowable world, distant past, cultures of strangers that we'll never encounter, abstract laws, where we embrace ideas not because they're true. We don't really care whether they're true. We embrace them because they're interesting narratives with the right morals. Now, intellectual elites have signed on to the conviction that all our beliefs should fall into the reality mindset, including things that take place long ago and far away and in abstract realms of science. For most people, beliefs that don't impinge on our day-to-day lives can fall into the mythology mindset. It's kind of irrelevant whether they're true or false. Are they good stories with the right morals? So the answer to the question, why do otherwise rational people believe weird things, is they don't, in the same sense that they believe grass is green and that we believe that wind farms can't cause cancer. If any of you know relevant research in psychology or cognitive science, I would love to learn more, or if you have questions about the project or about human rationality in general. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve, for that presentation. Great to see the new class and the new book. Really exciting. Unfortunately, I see Jessie has a hand up. Unfortunately, we're at time, so I would encourage Jessie to email Steve with her question or comment. Thank you so much, Steve. Next up is John Weiss.
Thank you, Matt and Talia and Steve, for your great talks. And happy Harvest Day from the Lab for Youth Mental Health. This is our crew. And our interest is primarily on mental health problems in children and adolescents. in part because the point prevalence of mental disorders in young people is quite high, about 18% worldwide. It's identified as a leading cause of youth disability, and evidence suggests that nearly half of all lifetime disorders emerge by age 14, and this suggests the potential contribution of early intervention. And so clinical scientists have been busy. Can everybody hear me? Matt, could you give me? Oh, great, thanks. So clinical scientists have been busy developing and testing interventions. In fact, so busy that over the past 5 decades, there have been more than 500 randomized clinical trials testing various youth psychotherapies for various problems. The tested therapies are generally focal, meaning they focus specifically on one type of disorder or problem. They are linear in design, highly standardized, as shown in this highlighted yellow example at the bottom of the screen. But what we've learned over the years is that most young people who actually go into treatment don't look very much like those therapies. Most referred youths have multiple disorders and problems, so not a very good fit to focal therapies. Youth problems and treatment needs tend to fluctuate often, so not a good fit to linear therapies. And different young people, even those with the same disorder or diagnosis, may need very different approaches. Poor fit to standardized treatment. So to address these difficulties, we've developed and evaluated therapies that use these components that have been tested, components and procedures from 5 decades of research, which we value very highly. But we've organized them in a way designed to produce treatments that are transdiagnostic and modular and personalizable. Our first effort in this regard was bringing together components of cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety, cognitive behavioral therapy for depression, and behavioral parent training for conduct problems. This resulted in a protocol called MATCH. More recently, we've tried to streamline and support easier access by clinicians to the skills by organizing these therapy procedures within 5 core principles of change: calming, increasing motivation to change, repairing thoughts that are unhelpful, solving problems, and identifying the positive opposite of behavior that's causing a problem, and then practicing that positive opposite. With both of these modular transdiagnostic treatments, we encourage therapists to personalize treatment, and we guide their efforts by flowcharts like this. And we try to inform their efforts by providing weekly progress monitoring assessments like the dashboard shown here, which can help therapists identify what parts of what they're doing seem to be working well and which parts may need to be changed. These approaches, of course, were all designed for therapy in normal times, therapy that looks like this. But as we know, the world changed dramatically about March. And now therapy looks like this for adults and for children. So from spring to now, we've been exploring what the pandemic may mean for youth mental health care, what problems arise for young people and their parents, and how effective can therapy be when it's delivered remotely, which is what's happening now, and in what forms can remote therapy work. So some preliminary steps we've taken: a consumer survey that I'll describe in a moment, a meta-analysis that I'll describe in a moment, a courageous program evaluation effort led by Catherine Corticelli and her colleagues at Phillips Brooks House on campus, in which they piloted a Zoom therapeutic summer camp program for kids in Cambridge. You can imagine the challenge of doing that remotely. And finally, Nathan Hollinsade and Audrey Edelman are leading a qualitative study to try to understand what mental health care that's school-based looks like when kids are not actually in school. Starting with the survey led by Olivia Fitzpatrick, the surveys were conducted between April and early July. 133 parents of children and adolescents participated. We included standardized measures of mental health symptoms on the part of parents and for their children. We included idiographic open-ended questions in which parents were asked, what are your top problems? What are your child's top problems? What help do you need most now? And what about your kids? What do they need most now? We found, first of all, that COVID-era symptom levels, shown in orange, were above clinical cutoffs for kids and for parents. These are the most common problems identified during the pandemic. Perhaps not a huge surprise to any of us, but important to know. And then we asked open-endedly what help is most needed right now. And out of all the possible forms of help that could be identified, the number one was mental health services, identified for parents and for adolescents. And for children, mental health services were ranked fairly high. We also used Johns Hopkins COVID restrictiveness ratings to classify the cities and towns where our families lived. And we found that more lenient policies with regard to face mask distancing, business openings, et cetera, were associated with higher levels of parental and youth mental health symptoms. Turning to a second project, a meta-analysis of youth therapies delivered remotely. This was led by Catherine Ventura-O'Connerly. We first surveyed randomized trials from the 60s to 2020, and we found that relevant studies only really began to appear in 1988. This is a picture of some of the characteristics of the study pool. We found 36 articles, 41 treatment control group comparisons. We asked, first of all, how well do remote therapies work? And we were encouraged by the findings. The benchmark comparison shown in purple is a meta-analysis that we published in the American Psychologist in 2017 that included 453 studies of like normal therapy in normal times. And what we found in terms of post-treatment outcomes is remarkably similar mean effect sizes for remote therapies and all therapies. And at follow-up, the news looked actually slightly better for remote therapies in terms of holding power of interventions, averaging 9 months after the end of treatment relative to the benchmark comparison from 2017. We looked at relative effects for different treated problems, and we found that remote therapy looks to be particularly successful for anxiety and conduct, not successful at all, unfortunately, for ADHD. Very difficult to treat that remotely. And depression treatment is absent from the graph because there are so few studies. We turned then to what types of therapy make a difference. We found that interventions involving cognitive focus and behavioral change fared well when addressed to young people and when addressed to parents, and that all the other interventions combined didn't do very well, as you can see. Then we looked at comparison between interventions that have all the therapy self-contained within the intervention and those that involve clinicians in some way delivering a portion of the intervention. That was slightly more than half of the remote treatments. And we found a pretty striking difference suggesting that having clinician therapeutic contact included may help. We looked at what kind of contact, and we found two in particular that seemed to matter. Clinicians supporting skill building by kids, learning the skills that they were learning in therapy, and then discussing with kids implementation difficulties that they were facing, sort of helping kids with their psychotherapy homework, for example. This clinician contact finding is very useful. The potential value of clinician delivered therapeutic content may be very important to us in our next steps. Thus far, we've developed digital interventions with an eye on maximum scalability. So we put all the therapeutic content into digital programs, no clinician contact at all, which is great for scalability. The first effort was led by Jessica Schleider, published in 2018 with kids in Cambridge. The second, led by Tom Osborne and Catherine Ventura-O'Connerly, and conducted in Kenya. And as you can see, these produced respectable effect sizes, but now we wonder if we can do better.
John, we're just about at time, so I'm going to have to ask you to.
Oh, okay, happy to stop.
Wind it up.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry, did you have what was the last slide?
Oh, well, Yeah, I can say future directions, and the most important future direction for us is someday to get our lab back to doing this, and I'll bet we all feel this way. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, and wonderful, wonderful sentiment to end on, and very much shared. Thank you so much, John. Really cool work. All right, next up, we'll hear from Mazreen Banaji, our last great chair.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Matt, can you say yes?
Yes.
Okay, all right, okay. Thank you for this opportunity to tell you a little bit about the work going on in the lab. I'm gonna tell you that, you know, a sentiment like this one is one that we will find very agreeable, given that, you know, we are people who are in the business of making new ideas based on new evidence that we ourselves generate. But the first part of John Cage's sentence is something that does happen. People are frightened of new ideas, and I had my own experience with this. It turns out that on September 4th, the White House issued an executive order, initially focused just on race education, but now includes gender. And the memo said that federal employees can no longer be educated about matters that concern race and gender, especially when the data make people uncomfortable and make them feel bad about themselves. None of this would have really mattered to me, except that I was scheduled to speak to several federal agencies. Last Friday, I was supposed to speak to the Department of Energy, and I am here to tell you that I was canceled. And so this is something that Harvard's OGC is looking into, because there are some federal agencies that have told me that I can still speak by arguing that I'm just a lowly professor. I'm not going to be training anybody. I'm just going to be giving them a seminar. So there are some agencies that are trying to circumvent it, but most have actually capitulated. And so this is my first experience actually at being canceled. Maybe some of you great people have already had that experience, but not me. This is it for me. All right, so for the rest of the 10 minutes, I am going to go incredibly fast and tell you about a whole bunch of stuff. And then hopefully you will send those questions to the Q&A box or to me directly. We study attitudes and beliefs, preferences, thoughts, that stereotypes that we may have about groups of people. And we look at this in the social group context. So humans vary and along many different dimensions in the groups they belong to. So whether it's you know, the non-arbitrary types of groups like age and gender, or arbitrary groups like race, culture, ethnicity, language, social class, these are the kinds of things that we tend to look at, and we look at both of these, attitudes and beliefs. And one of the questions that has consumed the field for the last several years is the question of, are implicit attitudes changing at all? And the reason this question is actually not a simple one is because people have taken very strong positions on this, especially one which says implicit attitudes cannot change. By their very nature, that's what they are, okay? They are automatic. We measure them using measures of the kind that in the 1970s, early 70s, people like Myers and Chabanavelt invented, like semantic priming. King primes queen. You can't will that away. You can't make that go away. That's what we know. That's what we have, right? And so off we went along with whatever, listening to these debates, and then along came the ingenious work of Tessa Charlesworth. And when Tessa begins to tackle a data set, I can tell you that it is a battle that she enters into. You can just read this and see why it is a battle. And in fact, you know, literally a battle. I think she has to eat lots of protein for the weeks leading up to it, and then huge doses of carbohydrates, pasta, right before she starts. And what Tessa did is took a 10-year period we have clean data for, and I'm going to show you this very rapidly, and even though you will have lots of questions on this, I can't go into this right now. What she showed is that over a 10-year period, implicit attitudes have changed in some cases, right?
You are muted.
Okay.
Muted.
All right. Okay. So it said the host muted me. Maybe it was I who muted me. All right. So I'll just show you really rapidly what the data show on sexuality. Tessa showed a huge amount of change. Why is this? Yeah, I'm stuck now. Looks like. Okay, there we go. 33% drop, which is an unbelievable drop. I personally would never have predicted seeing change like that in my lifetime. Change on race attitudes and skin tone, not to the same degree, of course, much less change on some others, and in fact, negative change on something like body weight. So today we are more anti-overweight than we used to be at the beginning of that decade. What I want you to take away from this graph, even though there's so much of interest, is just one thing, and that is that we have now shown that something that was considered to be automatic, rigid, inflexible, can change. To me, the 33% drop is now the lower bound that we can assume. Now it depends on what we want to do with ourselves that will dictate whether we change or not and in what direction we will change. So take that as the main result one, finding number one. And this is not an idea to be scared of, that implicit attitudes can change, even if the White House is terrified of it, and that change can last over long periods of time, unlike what the research literature until Tessa's work had said. Now, the other important thing to take away is that everybody is changing. Grandmas and grandpas and grandchildren are changing. Liberals and conservatives are changing. People on the coasts and the Midwest are changing. Educated and uneducated people are changing. And so you can see that that's another signature of these data, that there are really no demographic differences, except, of course, that even though everybody is changing, some groups are changing faster than others. And for the sexuality attitude, and certainly let's just focus on sexuality, two groups are changing much faster. Younger people are changing much faster. People who identify as liberal are changing faster than people who identify as conservative. So all I'll say is, go you graduate students. Okay. Second battle that Tessa took on is to see if this would happen, not just for these preferences. Okay, my notion of, you know, black is good and so on can be changed, but there are other things that seem more fixed in our world. You know, whether men and women belong to the domains of career and home, science and arts, those are stereotypes. And they veer a little bit closer to things that might actually be true in the world and are not going to be changing necessarily easily. So she looked at those data. These are also, this is slightly larger numbers actually, proportionally, of respondents, over 1.5 million tests. And I'm gonna give you the two results that she has from those two tests. Remember, test number one is the gender stereotype that men belong in the workplace and women at home. And the science arts test is that men are associated with science and women with arts. On both of those tests, we are seeing change, okay? So gender stereotypes are also changing, on average about 15% over a single decade, okay? And again, the answer to take away, don't worry about the little graphs, just remember, everybody's changing, okay? Except we can also still look at if there are any deviations from this. And here is one that I'd like you to carry away in your mind, and that is that men are the green line on the top and women the red line at the bottom. Men are changing at the rate of about 10% and women at 21%. And this is significant because we do not see gender differences in absolute level of bias or in change in almost anything else. But on the science arts one, women are pulling away and changing faster. I had a third and a fourth battle, but I will stop there and tell you that the work Tessa is doing now doesn't look at humans, looks at words, 70 million words taken from many different corpora to see if the cosine that we can compute for these pairings, female and kitchen or male and kitchen, vary from each other. And that work on word embeddings is very exciting, and it is showing very parallel results in terms of actual bias. And of course, the most interesting thing is, does it show change over a 200-year period for which we can look at books? And Tessa's work begins with 1800 and begins to look at people's thoughts and beliefs over the last 220 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahzarin. Absolutely amazing work. I would encourage anyone who has questions, comments, to please do reach out to Mahzarin via email, because we're out of time. Thank you so much, Mahzarin. Our next speaker is going to be Meena Chikara.
Excellent. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you all for joining me today. Today I want to talk to you about political polarization in the US specifically, but we'll also discuss how these ideas generalize beyond that context. Now, I'm sure that many of you have seen newspaper headlines or op-ed titles issuing a clarion call to stem the tide of growing political polarization. But there's a growing chorus of voices and reports indicating that we may not be as polarized as we think we are. So which is it? We're polarized beyond repair, or it's all in our heads? Well, it turns out it kind of depends on what we mean by polarization. So sometimes polarization refers to how extreme an individual's positions are for or against an issue. That is, when they move from being moderate to becoming more extreme, we say that they're becoming more polarized. But other times, polarization refers to the gap between the two parties, what some call the partisan gap or the partisan divide. And when groups move farther apart, we say that they're becoming more polarized. And this can be good. A healthy democracy needs competing ideas. Now, other times, polarization refers to how much each side dislikes the other side. And one issue researchers have been particularly concerned about is that this prejudice appears to have grown over time. Now, here's where things get interesting for me. Yet other times, polarization refers to people's beliefs about how extreme partisans are, or their beliefs about how much parties disagree. And just to make things really fun, sometimes polarization refers to what we believe they believe about us. This is what we call meta-perceptions, what we think they think about us. Now, meta-perceptions are special because they're forecasts related to the possibility of coordination. What I think you think about me guides whether or not I believe there's any credible chance of us getting together and getting something done. Now, by design, democratic governments require coordination amongst people who disagree. That coordination is what brings citizens services, infrastructure, and security. But if my meta-perceptions are overly negative, that is, I think you are outraged by everything that I stand for and everything that my group does, that forecloses on the possibility of coordination. It would be a waste of time to try. So my colleague, Jeff Lees, a former graduate student at HBS, and I wondered, just how distorted are these meta-perceptions? So in the spring of 2019, we asked a representative sample of 536 Democrats and Republicans to read a series of scenarios about inter-party sabotage. The scenarios ranged from one party changing a highway name to a beloved party leader's name, to one party gerrymandering a district in their favor. Now, each respondent was randomly assigned to one of three conditions. In the actual perception condition, we just asked Democrats and Republicans, how much would you dislike it if the other party engaged in this behavior? In the in-group perception condition, we asked people, how much would the average fellow in-group member dislike it if the other party engaged in this behavior? And finally, in the group meta-perception condition, we asked people, how much would the average out-group member dislike it if your party engaged in this behavior? Okay, so let's look at the actual perceptions first. Averaged across scenarios, Democrats and Republicans indicated a dislike of about the midpoint of the scale, 55 out of 100. So they didn't like it, but they weren't enraged. Now, what about estimates for fellow in-group members? Here we already start to see some misperception. People think that in-group members are going to be more upset to a tune of about 10 points than they actually are. But now let's turn our attention to group meta-perceptions. What you see is that the average estimate is 22 points higher than actual perceptions, with the greatest density at the very top of the scale, maximal dislike. In other words, people's meta-perceptions of how upset the other side would be are inflated by 40% relative to how the other side said they would actually feel. Note that Democrats and Republicans exhibited this pattern in equal measure. And this pattern replicated when we asked how opposed they would be or how unacceptable they found the behavior. Now, remember that I also told you that we asked about a series of scenarios that varied in how severe they were in undermining democracy. Interestingly, people were sensitive to severity. Sorry, this is blocking, isn't it? People were sensitive to severity when they were making judgments about fellow in-group members. So if I'm a Democrat, I say that the average fellow Democrat is more upset about gerrymandering than they are about renaming a highway. But this was not the case for group meta-perceptions. If I'm a Democrat, I think that the average Republican is outraged across the board, all the scenarios. Highway, gerrymandering, it doesn't matter, 90s, 100. All right, now it's not moving. Again, the reason this is so important is that these beliefs might matter, particularly for predictions about our ability to coordinate across partisan lines. But of course, we wanted to test this idea. So in another study, we also asked people to read the scenarios and report their meta-perceptions, but also their beliefs about how motivated the opposing party is by purposeful obstructionism. That is, how motivated they are to stop us for political purposes, irrespective of the cost to the American public. As predicted, the more pessimistic a person's meta-perceptions across all three judgments, dislike, opposition, unacceptability, which are all indicated on the y-axis, the more they say that they think the other side is driven by purposeful obstructionism, indicated on the x-axis. So what do we do about all of this? Well, unlike intervening on actual polarization, that is trying to change people's actual issue positions or prejudices, which is really hard, combating misperceptions of polarization is just about improving accuracy, specifically improving accuracy about how they see us. So this highlights another way that meta-perceptions are really powerful. They're ultimately about us, what I think they think about us. Now, we all want to be liked and respected. So when I learn that the other side isn't as hateful toward me and my group as I thought, that has a chance to land. Said another way, people may be uniquely sensitive to corrective information about how others see us, certainly more sensitive than they would be about how wrong we are about them. So we tested this idea. In another experiment, we had people make the same group meta-perceptions across the same scenarios I mentioned before, but this time half of the participants were told how inaccurate they were. For example, to a Republican participant, we said, on the previous page, you said that you thought a Democrat would report dislike of 90 out of 100 if your party tried to gerrymander a district in your party's favor. But we polled 200 Democrats, and actually, they reported an average dislike of 65 out of 100. And then in the control group, we just showed participants the values that they had entered on the previous page without telling them how the other group actually feels. Finally, in the third step, we asked respondents to what extent they thought the other side was motivated by purposeful obstructionism. So those people who received corrective feedback about how the other side actually feels were less likely to say than the control group that the other side is driven by spiteful obstructionism. But even more exciting, the more pessimistic respondents were, that's these people indicated in blue who have +1 standard deviation of inaccuracy, the bigger the effect of our intervention on lowering their belief that the other side was guided by political sabotage. Those who were initially accurate didn't change their replies, so there was also no weird backlash effect to receiving that information. And I can share with you hot off the presses that these results replicate across cultures. So a team of over 80 researchers led by a colleague, Kai Ruggieri at Columbia, but also including me and Jeff, replicated both our effect and our intervention with over 10,000 participants spread over 26 countries. So we know that this is not uniquely a US or even a political phenomenon. What we see is that meta-perceptions are consistently overly negative, indicated in blue, relative to red, for the outgroup for every single country in which we tested except for Sudan. And the corrective intervention in blue is consistently associated with lower negative motive attributions in the control group, though of course some of these differences are within the margin of error. And as usual, the Trump administration is right on top of this phenomenon. So this is from a pro-Trump fundraising mailer, and the message is, they hate you, so it's okay to hate them back. And this is the genius of the Trump strategy. It's always to put supporters in a defensive crouch. Almost any behavior is morally acceptable if it's done in self-defense. And if you look at the bottom of this flyer, the fundraising campaign is literally asking for help fighting back. But fighting back against what? So, as we ramp up to the election, I want people to recognize that our experience of the world unfolds always through the lens of our expectations, which for many of us may be overly pessimistic, and that to change, we need to engage less with the models or caricatures of the other side and more with the people who are actually standing in front of us.
Great. Thank you so much, Meena. Really amazing and such, unfortunately, relevant work. Thanks so much for sharing it. We unfortunately don't have time for questions, but as always, if you have questions, comments, suggestions, connections to make, please do reach out to Meena. Our next speaker is going to be Liz Spelke.
So I need to share my screen. Let's see. Hope this will work. Can you see it?
Yes.
Hey, okay. So first of all, let me just say that I am completely blown away by every single talk that has come before me, Meena, Marzu, everyone else. It's totally amazing, and I feel so proud to be in a department where all this work, which is fundamental basic science, but also so incredibly important for the moment that we're in right now, is taking place. Now, I wish I could say that my own lab was as relevant as all of you are to the situation that we're in now. It's not. My lab has been devoted really for as long as it's existed to studying infants and young children and trying to use these studies both to understand something better about something more about how knowledge grows in humans, but also to understand more about how our knowledge is organized and in our adult minds. And I do this through behavioral experiments taking place in a now closed lab in William James, focused on infants and on children. And through those studies, how do I advance this?
You're not in slideshow mode.
Oh, okay, now I am, right?
Now you are, yes.
Okay, thank you. So infants and children, and through that, try to answer these basic questions about how the mind is organized. Of course, the mind is a complicated thing, so answering them means teaming up with people who use different methods to try to triangulate on the same problems. And I've done this with many different collaborators who study cognition in other animals, where you can bring a bigger panoply of methods to bear. I'm pointing to Giorgio Valortigara because this is a collaboration that was made possible by Alfonso's wonderful Center for Mind-Brain Sciences in Rovereto, Italy. Also teaming up with people who, like Meena and others, have studied brains and tried to figure out by looking at brain function, both in adults and in kids, getting more insight into the nature of our minds. People who do computational cognitive science, especially our own Tomer and others, who've taken on the task of trying to develop models both of what infants know and how children learn. And also people in economics who do really the only work, which I won't be talking about today, that I think might have some practical significance in the world, asking how we can leverage basic understanding of how children learn to enhance learning in school and readiness for learning in school for kids living in poverty. So all of this work has led me to a picture that we begin equipped with a bunch of different cognitive systems, each of which is present and functional at birth and has some very interesting properties. They enable us to make sense of one another. They enable babies to make sense of objects and events and places in their environment. And they capture abstract properties of these things and deliver representations that can support children's learning. I also think we're getting some insight into how children actually go beyond these basic abilities by using language and other symbol systems. And with our computational colleagues, we're starting to play with ideas that generative models of the world, programs for simulating events that could take place in different domains, can serve both to enhance children's learning and our learning and memory as adults. So all of this would normally be what I would be talking about, and I would be taking one example of research from this domain and spending my remaining however many minutes it is, Matt will let me know when I'm done, telling you. Actually, I would then start to talk about this until Matt got up and forcibly stopped me from going over my time. But what I want to do today is something different and talk about my lab, not about what we've been studying, but about what we've been doing. And when I say we, I really don't mean me. I mean everybody else in the lab since our lab closed back in March. Now, at the time that the lab closed, I figured this isn't going to change my life terribly much because I don't actually do anything in my lab. I talk to people about what they do in the lab. They're the ones who were there on the ground, programming our experiments, developing our displays, training, to a cadre of people to collectively test kids, poring over the data and so forth. And then what I do is talk and write. And talking and writing are really maybe the only activities we engage in that haven't been radically changed along with all of the other changes going on. But for everyone else who's involved in our research, the changes that occurred back in March seem really onerous. First of all, obviously, all of the studies in our lab stopped. Second, our lab houses a cadre of undergrads who are involved in our research. They were all abruptly sent home at that point. We also had full-time interns from Europe who went back home. Our own grad students and postdocs and faculty advisors, some of them had stayed around, but had to make some radical transitions, including changing where they were living and, of course, changing how they were teaching. And for those who had children, trying to work out how to take care of their kids. And then, of course, the other group of people who we utterly depend on for our research are all the parents and children in the community who give us their time, who come into the lab to work with us, and who now found themselves in the midst of many, highly discussed challenges. So with all of this, my prediction was this will be a time for writing, for reflection, for people taking care of themselves, and let's not have too high expectations for the research. Now, one thing I turn out to be really good at is making false predictions about how my research is going to go in the future. And I'm really happy to say that this was maybe the most spectacular case of that. So what actually ended up happening? Well, a ton of things ended up happening, and I couldn't possibly tell you about all of them in the 10 minutes, but I want to point to some highlights. One thing that started in March and came to fruition in May was the development spearheaded by Laura Schultz and Mark Sheskin with the other people on this slide, including Elizabeth Bonowitz, who has now joined us at the Ed School. They started a website where developmental labs all over the world could pool their information from their own databases and create a clearinghouse so that parents could participate in research anywhere. So this now became available to us. Our subjects became available, participants became available to them, and it provided a way of connecting with people over the web for web-based testing of kids. Now, in order to do this, of course, we needed protocols for web-based testing. And here again, the larger developmental community sprung into action. I particularly want to signal the work of Hyo Guan, who most of us know from her previous many visits here. Hyo developed a whole protocol for Zoom testing that allowed labs all over the world to begin to try it out and adapt it for their own procedures. And in our lab, the primary people adapting this protocol were Ashley Thomas, who tried it out on her studies, testing whether infants are sensitive to the distinction between thick relationships of the sort that occur within a family and thin relationships of the sort that might occur in a neighborhood or between kids in the same classroom and so forth. Shari Liu tried it out on her studies, looking at children's understanding of things and people and how these interact with each other. And Brandon Wu tried it out on his studies of young infants' understanding of mental states, probing whether infants understand more about mental states in a social context than they do in a context where a person is simply acting on an object. And of course, the great thing that happened is that as they tried these things, this platform out, they discovered ways of improving it. Shari set up a blog that disseminated all this information to different developmental labs around the country, and everybody's lab started building on the insights that they were sharing. And I am down to the end. So let me just, okay, I think I'll make it though. So that was for the infant work. Meanwhile, for our work on older children, we faced a real problem because we had been developing materials for children to be playing with in school, concrete materials. But an effort led by Akshita Srinivasan looked at whether these materials could be adapted to be played in kids' homes, starting first with the materials that we've been using for many years now that aim to enhance kids' readiness for learning math. But then she got really ambitious and started developing new materials aimed to enhance kids' readiness for learning to read. And we're hoping to be able to disseminate these to kids and test out their effectiveness in the coming months. And finally, Joe Coffey, who works on language acquisition with Jessie, has also been very involved in the lab to develop language measures that we could be using in our studies of poor children in Africa and South Asia, and also working to adapt those studies so that they can be conducted safely in these countries by partially remote testing during the lockdown. So what has all this done to our productivity? Here's our calendar from February 2020, the last month that we had studies in the lab. The large...
This is the point where Matt comes up on stage and says you have no more time.
Okay, this is my last slide, I think. This is, if you look just at the thin lines, you'll see we tested 19 kids that month. That wasn't too bad. Here's our last month now. This is August, 64 kids tested overlapping on different studies. This is a measure, I think, of what these people have been doing, and I definitely exclude myself as the one who simply talks to them, what they've been doing and what they've been able to accomplish. I do want to say one last line. I might be the oldest, I think I'm the only person who's talked so far who's old enough to have parents who served in World War II. They would tell me about the excitement of coming together and doing something in a time of diversity. I don't think my lab is contributing to the world in anything near as direct a way as many of the people who talked before me today, but I'm definitely seeing them come together in a way that has left me in awe and inspired, and I wish the same experiences for all of you. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz. So amazing work and really beautiful to see. Thank you for sharing all of that. Our next presenter is Fiery Cushman.
Thanks. This is an awesome set of talks and a really poignant reminder of how much I miss coming to work with you all. But I've been lucky to be able to continue to work with the folks in this Zoom room here who've been doing an amazing job of keeping things going. And I wish I could talk about everything that everyone's been doing, but I'm just going to focus on one particular project, which postdoc Sydney Levine has been working on for 3 reasons. One is that this is, it's a perfect project for Harvest Day because she's been, putting effort into this for years and years and years. And it's finally come to a culmination. Second, because we're literally harvesting it next week. It's coming out in PNAS. So congrats, Sydney, on that. And then finally, because like any good harvest, we're celebrating what's happened, but it's also produced seeds for the next planting. And the ideas that Sydney is growing out of this project are just, I think, really going to shape the field. So I want to start with the observation that many of us are probably feeling like we have a moral obligation to vote in the coming election, and just pose the question, why is that? Why do we think that it would be morally wrong to skip voting? So there's a lot of theories that we could bring to the table currently in moral psychology, that we think that we would harm somebody if we skipped voting, or we think there's a rule or a norm, or that we have an affective reaction to the thought of skipping voting. And yet none of these really seem to do the job, because of course, like a single individual's vote almost certainly makes no difference. And to skip voting is perfectly legal. And in fact, it's very common. And there's nothing all that emotionally arousing about the thought of skipping voting. But if you ask people, so then why would you feel like you're morally obligated to vote? Something that they'll often say is, well, look, what if everyone thought that way? I mean, what if everyone skipped voting? Then where would we be? So if it's something that everyone needs to do, then I should do it myself. And we wanted to try to capture that idea. This is a super prominent idea in moral philosophy. It's the basis of Kant's moral philosophy. There are rule utilitarian theories, contractualist theories, contractarian theories. These theories are in many ways wildly different, but all of them draw on the idea that we can answer the question, am I required to do something, by asking ourselves, well, what would happen if everybody did or did not do that thing? But despite all the philosophical interest, it's remarkably underexplored in moral psychology. The one notable exception is Kohlberg's work. Kohlberg famously proposed that children progress through 6 stages of moral development, and his 6th and final stage is basically a theory of universalization. But the funny thing is that Kohlberg thought that nobody was capable of this form of moral reasoning until at least their late teenage years, but that even into adulthood, most people would never achieve the 6th stage of moral reasoning. In fact, he thought that most people who ended up evincing it at all had some explicit training in Kantian philosophy. On the other hand, you can go to your local bookstore and find a book pitched for, kindergartners called What If Everybody Did That? So one possibility is that this was written by a Kant scholar for very young Kant scholars, but another possibility is that somehow Kohlberg was missing something. And we wanted to ask, where would we have to look to see whether adults or children, without an exposure to philosophy, are spontaneously using this way of making moral judgments? Now, the problem is there's a lot of places where the logic applies, but it doesn't feel like an especially good fit or explanation. I'll give an example, like punching somebody. A lot of people think it would be wrong to punch somebody, but it seems like a weird explanation to say it's wrong because what if everybody did that? And at risk of belaboring this point, I just want to make this kind of visually clear why it feels like a strange explanation. If we relate the number of people punching to the welfare consequences aggregately of people punching, every single punch aggregates and brings welfare down by the same amount. And so although it's strictly true that if everybody were punching, that would be a very bad outcome for aggregate welfare, it's not a particularly important observation because even one instance of punching is already enough to bring down aggregate welfare. Instead, the logic of universalization really has its teeth in collective action problems, problems like sustaining a fishery, for instance. So how would that same curve work in the case of sustaining a fishery? Well, you might think that when the first person starts to harvest more fish, there's no immediate negative consequences. In fact, this could even be a positive thing. Maybe they're better off and the fishery is still sustainable, so they're making nobody else worse off. But there's a certain threshold number of actors where you're going to see a precipitous drop in utility. And what that means is that if hypothetically you were to universalize that behavior of catching more fish, then eventually, just in that hypothetical case, there would be a negative outcome that would harm aggregate welfare. We call this class of problems threshold problems, and they're really prevalent. Voting is an example, bank runs are another example, vaccinations are an example. Here's a meta-analysis of projections on the effect of global warming on GDP. You can see it's a classic threshold problem. A small increase in global temperatures actually probably raises worldwide GDP, but then you hit a critical threshold at which you start to see aggregate welfare losses. The problem is that if you apply the strict logic, you would quickly reach an absurd conclusion. So for instance, would it be permissible for me to go swimming this weekend? Well, what if everybody went swimming? That would be a disaster. What this illustrates is that even though we say, what if everybody did that? What we mean is a little bit more subtle. What we really mean is, what if everybody felt at liberty to do that? Presumably everybody does feel at liberty to go swimming this weekend, but they're actually not interested. Because the number of interested parties is low, it's not a problem if we all feel at liberty to go swimming. But perhaps if we all felt at liberty to skip voting, the number of people who would be interested in skipping voting is high enough that it really would cause a problem, thus prohibiting the cases that we want to prohibit while still allowing the cases that we want to allow. So let me give an example of how we implement these ideas. Here is a study in which we describe a fishing town. And in this fishing town, there are 20 people who engage in fishing. It's a classic threshold case. If they take too many fish, there's going to be negative consequences for everybody. And then we say either as somebody walks around with a new lure that can catch more fish and describes this to all of his neighbors, only 2 of them would even in principle be interested in using the new lure versus 20 of them would be interested in using the new lure. We're going to predict that people will give different moral judgments of how wrong the person's behavior is. But crucially, and this is a really critical point, every single person tells him, I'm committed to not catching more fish. So 2 people are saying they're interested, but they're not going to catch more fish because they're committed to traditional fishing practices, or 20 people say that they're interested, but are not going to catch more fish. So no matter what, if he starts fishing, there's not going to be a problem. But the question is, if all the interested people started fishing, would there be a problem? We see that this makes a big difference in the way that people make moral judgments. Now, one obvious explanation that doesn't appeal to universalization for these results is the possibility that when 20 people tell you that they're interested in having more fish, but they're personally committed to traditional fishing practices, this just establishes a stronger norm in the community. So people are worried about violating that norm, not about the hypothetical consequences of universalization. We can rule this out by considering a case in which, again, 20 people tell you they're not going to use the new hook to catch more fish because they're committed to traditional fishing practices, but in a fishery where there's more than enough fish for everybody, where even if all 20 of them started engaging in fishing, there would be no reduction in welfare because there's no threshold that you're going to cross. And so contrasting these 2 conditions, one with the presence of a threshold and one with the absence of a threshold, we find that that makes a difference in a way that can't be explained by an appeal to norms. We're then able to construct increasingly more complicated cases, for instance, contrasting situations where thresholds occur at different levels, where we would make identical predictions if a small number of people are interested, an identical set of predictions if a large number of people are interested, but different predictions if an intermediate number of people are interested, and we find patterns of moral judgment that match this precisely. And by formalizing our model of universalization and formalizing the various competitors that I've alluded to, we're able to show that we can explain not just qualitative, but really quantitative patterns in the data. Matt, can I get a quick finger on time?
You're at time.
0.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Sydney also does this with young children and finds that we see patterns of this behavior down to 4 years old, and intriguingly, no patterns of developmental change over that period. And I'll leave it there. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Fiery. Congratulations on the harvest and the seeds. Really cool to see. Our next speaker is going to be Rich McNally.
Hey, thank you, Matt. I'm not bothering with slides, so I'm just going to talk. I first want to acknowledge my graduate students, Sean McGee, Mike Asario, Ben Billette, Peyton Jones, and Emily Bernstein. Our group studies anxiety and related disorders, and we have had a number of different research streams. I've talked about these before, and just to sort of follow up on some of this. One is network analyses approaches to psychopathology. The network approach is quite different, for example, from the sort of standard neo-Kraepelinian reflective models embodied in the DSM-5, whereby symptoms are indicative of the underlying disease entity that produces the emergence and covariance of symptoms. Network analysis sort of flips this on its head. So the disorder is sort of an emergent property arising from the interactions of the constituent symptoms. that are part of a diagnostic cluster. And one of the publications, I'll talk about some of the publications that were harvested, appeared this past academic year, or in press. Peyton Jones at Multivariate Behavioral Research led the charge with the lead author on devising a bridge centrality metric, which is a sort of a principal way of identifying symptoms that are likely to produce the picture of diagnostic comorbidity. And so we published papers using this method with eating disorders and obsessive compulsive disorder and body dysmorphic disorder, the disorder of imagined ugliness as it's called, and major depression. We've also used network analyses to illuminate some of the other things that we've been doing in another line of research, that of exercise, particularly aerobic exercise, and emotion regulation. You know, everybody hears the story that, well, if you're feeling down in the dumps, you're depressed or sad or anxious, you know, go for a run, you feel better. Well, that's true. But one of the things that we had discovered a couple of years ago, Emily Bernstein being the lead author on these, was that if a person exercises, aerobic exercise, not stretching exercises or relaxing, but aerobic exercise, what this tends to do is render the person more resilient to stressors that they encounter after that, okay? So exercise first, then you either watch a sad film and you tend to bounce back. You get sad, but you bounce back quicker than those persons doing stretching exercises or merely relaxing before watching the film. So in another experiment in this line of research, we examined aerobic exercise versus stretching, and then looked at rumination, and this was a speech stressor. So like you have to give this, the Trier social stress test, where you have to give this spontaneous speech and all this other thing. So we sort of used network analysis to unpack the concept of rumination, which is dealing with a negative self-referent thought. There's a lot of elements to that, typically combined as a sum score. We broke it apart into a network, and when the dust settles, what we find out is that what happens here is that when people have done the aerobic exercise, then give the speech, what it does, it blunts or attenuates their self-criticism. And that seems to be the driver of this effect of fostering resilience, at least with this particular paradigm. Another line of research that I mentioned last year was dealing with trigger warnings. It was sort of a controversy in academia, largely, the idea that many students might be struggling with memories of trauma and therefore subject to having PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, psychophysiologic reactivity triggered by reading articles or hearing lectures of disturbing content. So it was a big controversy. It was mainly like a one between the sensitivity to the needs of survivors versus the issue of academic freedom. A historian might say, how can I teach the history of the 20th century without talking about all these horrific events? We're more interested in the psychological issues involved. Are trigger warnings helpful, harmful, or neither? Really don't know. And so we did experimental studies whereby we were focusing on literature, right? And so we had passages from literature that either emotionally neutral or moderately stressful or very stressful. One of the examples is, the scene from Crime and Punishment where Raskolnikov murders the pawnbroker, those sorts of things. We'd randomly assign people to get trigger warnings, not get trigger warnings, and so forth. I just got to give sort of a big view picture of this, not get into the weeds too much in the methods. But basically, we found in the original study, which was basically an unselected MTurk sample of mainly folks in their 30s, trigger warnings. I should step back just a second. There's two reasons that we want to see this psychologically. On the one hand, you say trigger warnings should be good. You should do this because predictable and controllable stressors are a lot less pathogenic than unpredictable, uncontrollable ones. So by giving someone a trigger warning, it's a matter of being forewarned is forearmed. And therefore, if you're ready for dealing with something that's going to be challenging for you, you should be less anxious because you're not surprised by something that is surprisingly distressing, okay? On the other hand, you could say, well, there's an implied message here, an implied message that of avoidance, a counsel of avoidance. So if you're struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, that what you need to do is to avoid stimuli that will trigger reminders of the trauma, right? That's the idea. And that will, in fact, reduce the likelihood of temporary acute distress. But in the long run, avoidance tends to maintain PTSD. And so it could be counter-therapeutic in the long run. So you got these two opposing views, and we didn't know which of these might be the correct one. We replicated our first study, which was led by Ben Billette and also with working with Peyton and I, in a college sample, and it's appearing in Journal of Experimental Psychology Applied, and we found basically the same kind of pattern. Is that the forewarned versus is forearmed wasn't really doing what it was hoped to do. And this is a general college sample, right? So it tended to make people anxious, but not reliably anxious, not that much, and it didn't last. Okay, that's just the short answer on that one. The next study, or a pair of studies actually, the next publication in the series, Peyton Jones was the lead author with Ben and me. We actually recruited individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder. They were trauma survivors in two separate studies. And here we're dealing with PTSD patients. Or probable PTSD. We didn't diagnose them through standardized psychiatric interviews, obviously, but they met all the criteria. And once again, we found that the people who were forewarned were simply just got more anxious than the people who weren't, even with PTSD. But again, it was a temporary, reliable, but not a very big effect. The only thing that we found that was a little on the alarming side was there's a tendency for people then to regard their traumatic experience is more central to the sense of identity. The centrality of event scale is sort of a measure tapping to what degree the trauma is self-defining, to what extent it is it's a lens through which you see the future, interpret the past, sort of an autobiographical memory landmark. The more that's the case, the worse off your PTSD, cross-sectionally and prospectively. So we saw a little bit of an uptick on that. So what seems to be the case is that the trigger warnings produce a little temporary, minor increase in anxiety, but they don't seem to be particularly helpful. Since I'm on the topic of triggering, I'll mention another line of research that's quite new. Ben had stumbled upon this phenomenon of self-triggering. It's a long story, but this article appeared in Clinical Psych Science a couple of months ago. There's a group of trauma survivors who are describing this strong urge to seek out reminders of trauma in order to produce the emotional distress. They feel compelled, if you will, compulsively seeking them out. And it's not sure what the heck is going on with them. They want to stop it. It's ego-dystonic, right? But they feel compelled to do this. And it's not in a therapeutic sort of a way, like prolonged exposure in vivo. And the initial study examined some of the apparent motivations for that. And they're actually quite diverse. Some of these people are, they're doing this to punish themselves. It's almost has a little bit of the coloring of non-suicidal self-injury that Matt and Jill study. There's a little bit of, they're punishing themselves doing this. In other cases, what they're trying to do is to try to find meaning in the phenomenon. So some of them were childhood sexual abuse survivors. And by provoking the symptoms, deliberately provoking, and they're suffering while doing that, they hope to be able to get insights into answering, why me? Well, you know, why did this happen to me? Thinking that if they can get them back into that emotional state where they're kind of reliving the trauma again, that might possibly enlighten why this terrible things had happened to them. We've also done, I should also mention that we've done other studies as well, and that undergraduates, we've had three publications appearing this year with undergraduates who did honors thesis, Michaela Rodriguez, Gabriel Milner, and Sarah Horn. They're all the lead authors on those as well. They're studying diversity of topics dealing with cognitive manipulations to reduce loneliness, dealing with anhedonia, and responsiveness to positive stimuli, all sorts of things of this sort. So I think I'm about ready to get the hook right now. Yeah, I can't read
Got the hook. The hook is here.
But anyway, so that's a sampling of the harvest from the publications from this past year.
Great. Thank you so much, Rich. Thanks for sharing all of that excellent work. Next up, we're going to hear from Randy Buckner.
So what I wanted to do is actually review some of the things we've done over the last 25 years and then put in the context of what we've done over the last 25 weeks. My laboratory has a couple of different threads that are going through it at this time, and one of them involves trying to understand higher order networks in the brain. And this is just an image here of a single individual, and in color are 3 distributed networks across the brain that we've identified. And it's interesting to look back. Some of these networks are literally the first ones that I worked on as a graduate student. So take, for example, this network shown here in red that's distributed across many regions of the brain. If I look back over the years, we first identified this in 1995. We've had a lot of accumulated findings that we've synthesized in reviews. Then we've had discoveries that just don't fit, which has given us opportunities to write new reviews on the topic, and then predictions. And I just want to highlight a paper that I'm going to allude to in a few minutes by Lauren DiNicola. That's an excellent functional characterization of some of these networks. But rather than look backwards, what I wanted to do is talk about what we've done in the last 25 weeks to better understand these networks. And so what's been really interesting to me in this particular harvest is how much progress, I think this came across in Liz Spelke's talk as well, is how much progress and innovation has happened by actually doing things not in the ways that we've normally done them, new ways just by necessity. And so this is a picture of the laboratory stealthily taken by Connie last week on Zoom at one of our laboratory meetings. And one of the things I've been so proud of across the laboratory is just how much progress and engagement that each of the members of our laboratory have engaged over the last 6 months. And I don't have time to talk about all the projects, but I just want to mention 3 projects that are interesting extensions of the work that we've been doing over the last 25 years and actually have accelerated those discoveries. One specific project by Jingnan, a visiting scholar in Cambridge now, who comes to us from Shanghai, is what he did is he took the opportunity while he was online to figure out a way to download literally the text files of all of the tracer injections that are available in monkeys and every cell that's labeled, and then to project those onto 3D representations spun around here for one experiment, one injection from this marmoset brain connectivity database. And he was able to use that to make network maps in monkey anatomy that can recapitulate those networks that we've been studying for decades in humans. So here are the estimated networks that we think may relate to higher level cognitive function. And here they are in marmoset anatomical networks, suggesting that the motifs of these networks are at least 45 million years old. Another project where we made progress, and this is something we've been stumped on actually for a decade, and it is in the last 25 weeks. This project actually was an opportunistic project. Mark Eldaev, a collaborator with the laboratory, collected a really extraordinary set of data that involved individual subjects going in the scanner 31 times. And this was a clinical study that was trying to set the foundation for studying OCD, but it acquired an enormous amount of data that, basically more data we had at higher resolution than ever before. And we began a collaboration with a former postdoc, Thomas Yo, and members of his laboratory, in particular, Ruby Kong and Ayu Ping. And Ruby, at this time in January, was actually in Wuhan in quarantine. And so this was an opportunity for a distraction, but also we thought maybe for the first time we had enough data to answer a open question. And what it had to do with is trying to understand the organization of the cerebellum in relation to these higher order networks. Now, the cerebral cortex connects to the cerebellum. If you actually take the cerebellum, it's very small in the volume, which therefore requires higher resolution to understand. If you take it and you flatten it out, as has been done recently by Marty Serino, you'll find that it's 80% of the surface area of the entire cerebral cortex. What Ruby and Ayu Ping and Thomas did is they unfurled it on the cortex here by a probabilistic estimate. We took all the data we had and we can make measurements of the topography of these networks across the entire cerebellum. And this is the cerebellum unfurled and unrolled. And what you see is that the cerebellum, like the cortex, has all of these higher order networks represented with exquisite specificity. And just to give you an example of that, if you take a region, the small region of the cerebellum on the right side, because it's organized contralaterally to the cortex, you can see that it's connected to the entire distributed network we know as the language network. And right nearby it is a completely different network associated with these newly isolated higher order networks. And so this is something we didn't understand these details before. And just by reanalyzing data that existed, because we couldn't collect new data in this arena, we're able to push this forward, and you can get this paper online in bioarchives now. But one thing that I just want to dwell on is that when we talk about these networks, I think we've made great progress in carving nature at its joints and understanding the physical organization of these networks. But I call this a newly isolated, I use a vague term, higher order network. The functional characterization and how these multiple networks contribute to distinct domains and processes of higher cognition has been the open problem we've had great difficulty solving. And we've made some progress. These are data that I've shown previously. I think I showed these last year. But the big question is, can we get a better handle on the functions of these newly discovered higher order networks? And we've made some progress in the past using conventional methods. So here is, in black outlines in one subject, one of these higher order networks. And we've shown that we can functionally and selectively cause these networks, the whole distributed network, to become active during classes of tasks. Here we refer to as episodic projection, thinking about the past or imagining the future, things that Dan Schachter has heavily studied. And we could show that these are selective. For example, other domains of cognition, such as social inferences associated with theory of mind, activate adjacent but physically distinct networks. Now, the opportunity and the challenge of these kind of experiments is that they're very amorphous. We can show that we can functionally activate these distributed higher order networks using tests that tap into these higher level cognitive functions. So for example, in this particular study, Lauren had subjects answer questions such as the one shown here. Envision that you are a wedding of a specific friend 3 years from now. Are you seated at a table with close friends, acquaintances, or random people? This is a very high level question that presumably has lots of different processes. We don't understand these processes. Clearly, something about this kind of question taps a domain of cognitive function that will selectively activate this network, but it's been very hard to disentangle this. That said, the opportunity is that over the last years, we've acquired data on hundreds of these questions. And so here's the last experiment that I want to talk about, which is a crazy experiment that was done recently over the last 25 weeks by Lauren and Toby, a talented undergraduate in the laboratory, is what will probably become his thesis project. Now here's the experiment. Here's the data we have. This is in-hand, in-person data collected over the last several years, where we've estimated the networks in individuals, and we predicted these group question level functional disassociations in independent data. We have hundreds of these questions. And so what Lauren and Toby did is they went online, and this is completely new data, in new groups of subjects, and they took every single trial from these original data. They got online ratings of just arbitrary processes, and I'll show you that in a second. And then we asked the question, if you could see if these new ratings predict functional responses selectively in the original data, in the original networks, taken years ago and defined years ago. And here's what they discovered. The first thing I want to show you to the right is exactly what they did, is they had individuals online, completely different individuals, look at these questions, envision that you're at the wedding, but then ask them to introspect about how they did this. To what extent of this question, ask about matters that are significant to you, rely on personal past experiences, lead you to speculate about preferences, emotions, or thoughts, and ask many of these different questions. And they did this in aggregate over a large number of individuals. That they took that behavioral data, and Lauren did a hierarchical form of clustering on it that you're seeing the results here. This is purely behavioral data, what people introspect they're doing during these questions. You get interesting structure. You get things that look like processes we think of. So one, for example, is something that's been talked about by Demis Hazzabis is scene construction. For example, asking people questions, did they think about the locations of objects and places, visual imagery, or the locations of people? Is this cluster over here? Other clusters related to difficulty, and these were bottom-up driven by how people answer these questions. What's extraordinary is they predict functional dissociations with incredible specificity. So take this scene construction, if you now take it back to these networks, you'll show that certain networks don't care about this dimension at all. other networks, such as this one that we've been puzzled about, track it parametrically. Not only that, features of these questions and parameters that we get that were never part of the design, such as the difficulty, which is a confound, will predict selectively the behavior of other networks with complete disassociation. So I don't know where this work is going, but this was a crazy experiment. Collect online ratings and track it back, and it shows remarkable specificity. And so it's been a fun 6 months, and I can't believe how much progress we made. And so I just wanted to go over, these are the 6 months of our laboratory. Connie, again, as it says, stealthily captured the progress of the laboratory. And I've been very proud, and it's been a great pleasure to see all the progress on these data fronts.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Randy. Really cool work. And like with Liz, it's great to see some behind the scenes as well, what everyone's been up to and how they're doing. So thank you for sharing that. Next up, we will have a presentation by Dan Schachter. We can see your slides, Dan, but cannot hear you.
Let me unmute, start again. Okay, hear me now?
Yes, sir.
All right, so I want to begin by acknowledging my hardworking lab who have been soldiering through this difficult period, and progress is being made in a variety of online studies. I want to acknowledge some recent collaborators who've made important contributions, as well as funding sources. But what I'm going to focus on today are two recent developments on topics that have been of longstanding focus in my lab. The first has to do with brain underpinnings of memory distortion and false memories. And then the second, the role of memory in the hippocampus in episodic future simulation, what Randy was just talking about, as well as creative thinking and problem solving. And I'll hone in on future simulation and creative thinking in the second part of this talk. All right, the first part of this talk focuses on a study that I just think is very cool. That wasn't actually conducted in my lab. It was a collaboration with the laboratory of Sheena Jocelyn. Sheena Jocelyn is an eminent behavioral neuroscientist who's made pioneering contributions to understanding the neural basis of the engram, or the memory trace, at her lab at the University of Toronto in the Hospital for Sick Children. And she's done some particularly interesting work on the process she calls memory allocation. How do neurons become allocated to a memory trace, and can we manipulate their activity in some way to illuminate the nature of memory? Well, a couple of years ago, Sheena gave a talk at the Center for Brain Sciences that I was fortunate to attend. And I'm just going to give you verbal summaries of the stuff that she's done. And she reported some, what I thought were really striking results, using basically fear conditioning type paradigms with conditioning paradigms with mice, and some advanced techniques such as optogenetics. She was able to show, she and members of her lab, that at the time of an event, neurons are competing for allocation to an engram, or memory trace, which is supporting memory for a particular event. And what they show is that neurons with higher excitability win out in this competition. And then for a period of time after the event, these allocated engram neurons, what they call engram neurons, remain temporarily active up to about more excitable for about 6 hours than neighboring neurons. Point two, and this is what piqued my interest, if a similar event occurs within this 6-hour period where the allocated engram neurons are showing the heightened excitability, an overlapping population of neurons is going to be co-allocated to the second engram. And this serves to link these two memories that are occurring within this time period. So when Sheena was presenting these data, that really struck me as interesting, because as someone who's interested in similarity-based false memory, I wondered, could co-allocation leave the animal prone to memory distortion if elements of these two events are integrated and confused, since they're overlapping in their allocation to the engram? And I suggested kind of a very simple experiment that might be interesting to look at that issue. Well, much to my shock, if we fast forward, I think about a year and a half, Sheena gets back in touch with me and said, hey, we did that experiment. In fact, they did a much more interesting and elaborate version of the experiment than the one I suggested, and it worked. And she then generously involved me as a collaborator and a co-author. Anybody who wants the details on this study can look at a recent issue of Neurobiology of Learning and Memory, but let me just walk you through again. I'll do a verbal summary of what they found in the Jocelyn lab. So in this study, the key finding was that mice developed a false fear memory of a neutral stimulus, an auditory tone, which they had never received any shock with. If they were exposed to it 3 hours after, within that co-allocation window, but not 24 hours after, outside the co-allocation window, cued fear conditioning to another auditory stimulus where they really were shocked when they got a tone of a different frequency. But now they become afraid of this tone that was never paired with shock. You even get transfer from a visual stimulus, a light, if the second event occurs within the co-allocation window. As in co-allocation, the generation of the false memory depended on the post-training excitability of the engram neurons. So these neurons remain more excitable during exposure to the neutral stimulus at 3 hours, and that presumably is what's driving the false memory, but not 24 hours. And then finally, probably what to me the neatest part of this, makes cognitive neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists jealous because we don't quite have these techniques, but using optogenetics, they were able to silence the engram neurons from the initial event 3 hours after cued fear conditioning, and this basically blew away the false fear memory. Now they didn't fear the auditory stimulus because those initially active engrams were silenced with optogenetics. And then conversely, 24 hours later, if you optogenetically activate the engram neuron after 24 hours after fear conditioning, that shouldn't ordinarily produce a false fear memory, but now you do create one. So I think the work is very cool, and I just wanted to share that with people who might not otherwise be aware of it. Okay, part two is to focus on one of the core interests that we've pursued in my lab for quite a while now. Does the hippocampus contribute to imagination and creativity? We've done a bunch of fMRI studies shown here, carried out by various lab members over the past decade and more, showing that indeed you do get robust hippocampal activation when participants are scanned and they're given cues and imagine future experiences, or more recently, when they take a standard test of divergent creative thinking known as the alternate uses task. So again, you're given a cue word like a brick and you have to come up with novel but appropriate uses. All those produce activation in the hippocampus. But we've been trying more recently in the lab to complement this fMRI-based work with work using TMS to try to get more at the question of whether regions like the hippocampus are playing a causal role in these phenomena. So Preston Thakral has led all these studies, and one published a couple of years ago in Journal of Neuroscience that I think I talked about at Harvest Day a couple of years ago. Preston was able to show that if you give inhibitory transcranial magnetic stimulation to the left angular gyrus, that's part of what we and others refer to as the core memory or simulation network. And you compare that to TMS to a vertex control site, what you see is when people do an episodic memory or episodic simulation task a few minutes later, when the effects of the TMS still persist, they remember the past and imagine the future with less episodic detail than compared to when they've just received the vertex control stimulation, and the effect was selective. The TMS to the angular gyrus had no effect on a semantic-free association task, so it seemed to be selectively targeting episodic processing, both past and future. Now, importantly, work from Joel Voss's lab, published in Science back in 2014, has shown that applying TMS to the angular gyrus doesn't just affect the angular gyrus, it also impacts connected regions, including the hippocampus. So you can use stimulation of the AG to indirectly try to ramp up or ramp down activity in the hippocampus. So Preston's latest study used this TMS to the left angular gyrus compared with that same vertex control, attempting to modulate activity in the hippocampus, which was assessed with fMRI when people imagined a future event or did a divergent thinking task. Details are reported in a recent PNS paper that also include Kevin Medora, a recent graduate student, and Sarah Kalinowski, current graduate student. Here's a bare bones description of the study. So this was using a slightly different protocol known as continuous theta burst stimulation, CTBS. It's applied to the angular gyrus of the vertex control just before people go into the scanner, and they get word cues, and they either imagine a future event, they generate alternate uses, the AUT task, or they do a control task I won't go into. We've used many times in these fMRI studies involving generating sentences. Details of imagined experiences are coded into internal, that's episodic details, or external, that's non-episodic, using Brian Levine's autobiographical interview. Standard scoring of the alternate uses task, where you're scored for the number of novel appropriate uses, that's fluency, or categories of novel and appropriate uses, that's flexibility. Behavioral data in the A panel here, that's a nice replication of the Thackrell et al. 2017 study. When you're imagining a future event after angular gyrus stimulation, there are fewer episodic details. There's no impact on the control internal details, and no impact on external details. And new behavioral data, TMS to the angular gyrus, also reduces fluency and flexibility on the alternate uses. The first time I think that's been shown. Critically, hippocampal regions show a pattern that follows the behavioral data I just showed you. Hippocampal activity indeed is reduced during simulation and alternate uses performance following stimulation to the AG compared to the vertex, and no effect in the control task of anything goes slightly the other way. Importantly, parametric modulation analysis indicated that these behavioral effects that I just showed you, reduced episodic detail and fewer creative uses, modulated the neural effect on hippocampal activity. So the two were tightly linked. And we think these results move us closer to claiming a causal role for the hippocampus in future simulation and divergent thinking, with one caveat I'll leave you with. We observed effects in the hippocampus, obviously, but there are also some similar effects in a few other core network regions. So you can't claim that the observed effects only involve hippocampal dependent processes, but certainly the hippocampus is affected in a way that impacts performance. All done.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan, for that wonderful work. Awesome presentation. I'm especially excited to introduce our next speaker, who's going to be Mark Hatson, the newest member of our faculty, who is participating in his first Harvest Day. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, as Matt said, I just joined the department on July 1st. And since this is my first Harvest Day, I figured that I would use this opportunity to introduce you all to some of the work that our lab does. So at the broadest level, our work focuses on elucidating some of the biological, psychological, and social consequences of stigma. So when you hear this term stigma, you probably immediately think of concrete events and experiences that happen to people. Things like hate crimes and bullying, or being the target of stereotypes. And being psychologists, you probably also think about some of the psychological responses that members of stigmatized groups may have to these events and experiences. Things like anticipating rejection, becoming hypervigilant to threat cues in the environment, or concealing aspects of your stigmatized identity or status if you're able to, in order to avoid rejection and discrimination. And you wouldn't be wrong for thinking this. There are decades of research from psychological science showing that these are forms of stigma that matter for the health and well-being of the stigmatized. At the same time, though, this is just the proverbial tip of the iceberg. Stigma is, of course, much broader than these concrete events and experiences and responses. It's promulgated and reinforced through our social institutions, through the laws and policies that we choose to pass or not pass, and finally through broad cultural and social norms and attitudes that we have about members of stigmatized groups. Collectively, this is what my colleagues and I call structural stigma. And this topic has been really front and center in the public discourse in the last couple of months, with renewed attention paid to structural and systemic forms of racism and other forms of social inequalities. So in our work, we seek to triangulate evidence about the consequences of structural stigma using a multi-measure, multi-method, multi-group, and multi-outcome approach. And so in the limited time that I have today, I wanted to highlight 3 recent projects that some of my mentees in the lab have conducted to give you a sense of how we've approached this topic. So in one methodological approach, we've capitalized on the rapidly changing policy environment surrounding some stigmatized groups here in the US, which creates some unique opportunities for conducting quasi-experiments. So one of the methodological advantages of quasi-experiments is that they're exogenous events that occur outside the control of individuals. And so that minimizes threats to validity of selection into the quote-unquote intervention group. So this is one example of a quasi-experimental study that one of my mentees, Julia Raifman, took the lead on, which she published recently in JAMA Psychiatry. So in this paper, Julia used an econometrics approach that's known as a difference in differences analysis. So that enabled us to compare changes in mental distress among lesbian, gay, and bisexual or LGBT populations and heterosexuals who lived in 3 states that had recently implemented laws denying services to same-sex couples in the year 2015. And we compare those to changes in mental distress among LGBT individuals and heterosexuals who lived in 6 geographically nearby control states that had nearly identical demographic characteristics but hadn't implemented one of those laws. Our outcome data and data on sexual orientation come from the Behavior Risk Factor Surveillance System. These are representative population-based studies of non-institutionalized state residents ages 18 and over. So here are the results. This figure shows the changes in the percentage of adults experiencing mental distress and same-sex denial versus control states stratified by sexual orientation identity. On the y-axis is the percentage of the population that met criteria for mental distress. And on the x-axis are the 3 different time points. So 2014 was baseline, 2015 was the year the policy was implemented, and 2016 is a follow-up year. So you can see here that the only group to experience an increase in mental distress during this time period were the sexual minority adults living in one of those states with same-sex denial laws. And that was equivalent to a 46% relative increase in sexual minorities experiencing mental distress in those states. In contrast, you can see that there's no change in mental distress among any of the other 3 comparison groups. And in this analysis, Julia also used state fixed effects, and that does 2 things. First, it controls for baseline differences in rates of mental distress across states. And secondly, it controls for time invariant characteristics, like, for example, political climates that could theoretically influence both the passage and implementation of these laws and also the mental health of individuals living in those states. So in a second methodological approach, we've capitalized on what I'm calling unintended exposure to negative campaign ads that occur during a voter referendum on the rights of marginalized groups. These referendum are currently used in 27 states here in the US and occur with some regularity. So this was a project that Andrew Flores, a former postdoc, took the lead on that he published recently in PNAS. And so the primary approach that previous studies have used to answer this question is to ask people to self-report on their exposure to negative campaign ads that occur during these referendums. But one of the primary limitations to that approach is that it introduces recall bias, which can potentially overestimate associations with psychological outcomes. And so Andrew came up with, I think, a pretty clever way of overcoming that limitation through the strategic combination of 2 different data sources. So the first was the Gallup Daily Tracking Poll. This is a nationally representative data set that just so happened to be collecting data when 4 states were holding their voter initiatives on same-sex marriage. And our measures of LGBT status and psychological outcomes come from that data set. And then the second data source was from the Campaign Media Market Group, which we purchased. So these were objective media market data on the number of TV campaign ads for and against same-sex marriage that were aired in the 4 weeks leading up to the vote. And so the innovative design feature here is that it turns out that these media markets actually cross state boundaries. And so what that did is it created an unintended group of individuals in 12 states that had been exposed to these campaign ads, but weren't living in one of those 4 states with the voter initiative. This group is affectionately known as media market spillovers in the political science literature. And so with this unique data structure, we were able to compare psychological outcomes among these media market spillovers and compare those to outcomes among individuals living in non-spillover markets who weren't exposed to any campaign ads. So here are the results. On the y-axis is the predicted probability of self-reported stress. We find similar results for the other psychological outcomes that we examine, including negative affect. On the x-axis is total ad exposure, and these are stratified by sexual orientation identity. So you can see here on the left-hand side that increased exposure to these campaign ads was associated with greater self-reported stress among the LGBT spillovers. So for example, those living in communities with 400 ads had about a 34% greater probability of reporting stress compared to those living in non-spillover markets that weren't exposed to any campaign ads. And in contrast, similar to what you saw in the previous study, we see specificity of these results. So there's no association with the non-stigmatized group. And then third and a final approach that we've used recently are spatial meta-analyses. So these are really similar to traditional meta-analyses with the added step that you geocode where these studies are done and then link in contextual variables of interest, in this case structural stigma, and examine its association with outcomes of interest. So we've used this approach to address a really important question to clinical psychologists, which is whether the efficacy of our psychotherapy interventions depend in part on the social context in which they're delivered. But one of the methodological challenges of answering that question to date has been that almost all of our mental health interventions are conducted in one or a very small number of communities. And so as a consequence, everyone is exposed to the same social context. And so there's limited, if any, variation in which to detect an effect on outcomes should one exist. And so we overcome this limitation through reanalyzing a large meta-analytic database of youth psychotherapy randomized controlled trials that Professor John Weiss and his group conducted that you heard about earlier. And the innovation here is that we took advantage of the fact that these studies had been conducted across the US in communities that differed in terms of their level of structural stigma, in this case, stigma related to race. So we geocoded where those studies were done, linked in measures of structural racism, in this case, aggregated community norms and attitudes, and then examined their association with intervention efficacy. So this is an analysis and project that Maggie Price took the lead on. She's a postdoc, former postdoc in Professor Weiss's lab. So on the y-axis here is the effect size for these interventions, and on the x-axis is our moderator of structural racism. So you can see as at higher levels of structural racism, we see lower intervention efficacy in majority Black samples, indicating that Black youth derive less benefit from these psychotherapy interventions in communities with higher levels of structural racism. In contrast, we see no association, again, in the non-stigmatized group. So I think bringing this contextual approach to mental health interventions begins to open up several new questions about why our interventions really flourish in some social contexts and fail in others. And in our future work in this upcoming year, we're hoping to bring the same contextual approach to address other conceptual and methodological questions of interest in psychological science. So I'll just acknowledge funding for this work and the many amazing students and collaborators without whom this work certainly wouldn't be possible. And I'll end by just saying I'm really thrilled to be here, especially after a day like today, hear all of your presentations. And I'll look forward to hopefully getting a chance to meet all of you in the coming months. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. And welcome once again.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is going to be Jesse Snedeker.
Give me a second and I'll find it. Here we go, share. Had to get a question off to Mark. All right, can y'all see my slides? Awesome. So if you know one thing about me, it's probably that I study language. And I think I'd like you to know two things about me if you're new to the department or just new to me. And that is, the second one is that the part of language that I study is combinatorial semantics, how concepts get pieced together to make the meaning of larger sentences. And I look at that in a number of different ways. I look at moment-to-moment language comprehension and production in children and in adults. I do work on language development, looking at when children learn different constructions and how they learn them. I also do some natural experiments, similar to what Mark was talking about, actually, where I look at different groups of children who are differentially situated and see how they learn language. And then I do some things that I like to think of as experimental linguistics, where I take theories built on cross-linguistic variation and judgment, and I try to test them using other methods in the lab. One of the most wonderful things about being here is that over the years, many exciting and wonderful people have come to join me here to do this work. Maybe the only thing they have in common is look at what wonderful smiles they have, great smiles. Sadly, they eventually leave, most of them. They go off to academia, or some of them go off to what we quaintly call industry to make widgets and DAXs, or maybe to work for Apple and do translation, that kind of thing. But a few of them fail to escape, or at least have failed to escape so far. And you can find them wandering around on our virtual 10th floor, where they continue to do studies of moment-to-moment language processing, experimental linguistics, and language development. I'm not going to try to tell you about all these things. There'll be other harvest days. We can have other conversations. I thought I'd just like close in and talk about one particular line of work that Anne-Marie Kakab has been carrying out here and in Nicaragua over many, many years. And this work focuses on looking at a signed language as it develops, a brand new signed language. And critically, this work is only made possible by the heroic efforts of some coders who've been working in our lab on this project, research assistants for over a year now, Emma Van Beveren and Jessica Moore. And I'm going to be talking just about their work. I'm a cheerleader for this work. I helped to some aspects of design, but really this is Anne-Marie's project. I just think it's amazing. And this is also collaboration with Anne Senghaus. So the overall question that we're trying to ask whenever we look at evolving sign languages is just, where does linguistic structure come from? All languages in the world have many features in common. They have recursion, they have quantifiers, they have ways of expressing who did what to whom. And really there's only two stories about where structures like this could come from. One possibility is that they're the result of biological evolution, something about our minds that makes us think of the world this way and express our thoughts in this way. The other possibility is it's a result of historical evolution. Maybe it's more like mathematics or science. And of course, what that means is there's a difference in the timing of these events. We know that whatever was there for the biological contribution to language had to be present at the point when humans dispersed around the world. So really we're talking about two theories, right? Two extreme theories of how language came to be. One where all the work is done by biological evolution and there's minimal historical evolution. Another story where really biology gives us very little and then history builds it bit by bit. And of course, there's something in between, and there might be something in between for all sorts of abilities. They have both a biological basis and a historical basis. Now, this is a kind of big, sweeping, broad question that I would love to answer, but it's really hard. And it's really hard because you can't go back and look at exactly when something first appeared in language. We really only have records, written records going back about 3,000 years. And even when we do our best to reconstruct early languages, everyone who's honest about it admits it starts falling apart after about 5,000, 8,000 years. So we are missing 50,000 years of data. You might think we just give up on it then, but we haven't. And the reason why we haven't given up on it is there's a population we can look at that really actually allows us to leverage our way into this question. And these are folks who are creating their own languages, largely in isolation from any other human language. And specifically, we're focused here on how language gets created when new groups of deaf children come together and find themselves having to find a way to communicate. We're looking at the case of Nicaragua. Let me tell you a little bit about why Nicaragua is such an interesting case, Nicaraguan Sign Language. Folks in Nicaragua who were deaf were isolated from one another up until the late 1970s, when the very first group of kids was brought together in a school. That group of kids quickly developed some kind of assigned language. We don't know much about its earliest form. They taught it to the new kids coming in who expanded and grew it further, and they taught it to the third cohort. But there were continually new children arriving who were also growing up isolated linguistically from other speakers of the language. Now, by going back and looking at these different groups of people, the first cohort who's roughly my age, the second cohort who's in their 30s, the third cohort who's even younger, we can get a sense of what the language looked like at different points in its evolution. Now, the particular problem I'm going to tell you about today is how it is that languages encode who did what to whom, specifically how they encode the agent of the action, the doer, and the patient. When you look at spoken languages, there are three main devices that get used. In English, we like to use word order. Man bites dog means something different than dog bites man. In a lot of the world's languages, like Turkish, you stick little endings on the words that tells you who's the patient and who's the agent, and then you can move them around freely. In other languages, you really can move the words around freely and there are no endings on the nouns, but instead you stick information on the verb that tells you who the subject and object is, typically who the agent and patient is. So for example, Georgian does that for both subjects and objects. Many languages actually use multiple strategies. So in English, we have a little bit of case left over in our pronoun system. We love word order, and we have agreement with our subjects. Now, we had some expectations for how Nicaraguan Sign Language might do this. We knew that signed languages tended to be verb final, and NSL tended to be verb final. We knew that verb final languages often have free word order and often use case marking. Turkish is a good example, Japanese is a good example. We knew that agreement in signed languages tends to be spatial. You set up the agent in space, the patient in space, and then you move the verb from the agent to the patient. We also knew that across languages, grammatical devices usually begin being big and slow. So whole words, for example, in spoken languages. And they become smaller and faster over time. Then sometimes they actually completely disappear and you start the whole process over again. We also know that for case marking, patient case marking is both the most dominant form of case marking and it tends to emerge first. So this is the done to, not the doer. So what Anne-Marie did is she created these stimuli that could only be distinguished by noting who did what to whom. They were all transitive events, right? One of them was indicated as the target, and then the signers were told to try to convey this to somebody who was not present. What we found when we went back and looked and coded all this data, or actually when Emma and Jessica did, it was an epic adventure, is that word order was very highly variable. We did not see a consistent pattern of putting the subject first or the agent first. Instead, what we saw is that spatial marking was very frequently used. In fact, I'm looking here at the 3 cohorts of Nicaraguan signers, right? So the oldest, the middle, and then the very youngest over on the right. And what we saw here is that even the older signers, the ones who were speaking the earliest version of the language, were marking both of the arguments, placing them in space, something like 60% of the time. So that's in the green, the red is where they've marked one argument. What was changing during this time was how they use space. What Anne-Marie observed is that some folks were actually using physical bodies as space, right? So they were using very big units of space. This was mostly the first cohort signers. They would set up one of the referents on her body and set up the other referent on themselves, and then use that to mark the verb. She started seeing more medium-sized devices and then very small devices, little small movements in the 3rd cohort of signers. So this is what we expect from grammaticalization. The forms get smaller, basically more efficient over time, but less visible in a way. You have to be watching faster to catch them, right? They're taking up less space. All right, from my perspective, the absolute most exciting thing about this data is that Anne-Marie saw something that looks like a case marker that seems to be appearing in NSL. So you're gonna see a video here that has been slowed down. I think it's about half the speed that it would usually be at. And this signer, who's from that first cohort, so again, you know, he's in his 40s to 50s, he's seen a video where a firefighter punches a priest, okay? And so he's going to sign that for you. What you're gonna see him do is indicate priest, then he's going to give this patient marker, we think it is, then he's going to indicate firefighter, and then punch. All right, so you guys ready to see that? Priest, patient, firefighter, punch. All right, so what he's doing there, and we saw this quite frequently, right, is that after the noun, he's using this kind of stillness marker to indicate this is the one who doesn't do something, the one who has something done to them. And we think that is a prototype, an early version of a patient marker. And one thing that's interesting about it is notice there's like a full lexical item there, right? He's actually moving his lips like this, like stillness. These case markers did appear in a fairly large number of participants. So we saw about 22% of cohort 1 trials had these case markers in them, closer to over 30% of cohort 2. But one thing that seems really interesting to me is this case marking seems to be disappearing in the 3rd cohort. It seems to be a strategy that's largely being used as the language is still evolving and still developing. I think one hypothesis about this we're in the process of checking out is that in cohort 3, the case marking is disappearing as the spatial agreement system becomes more consistent across speakers, also becomes faster, right? So that it is both more reliable for both the comprehender and the speaker, and the signer to use. So one of the things that we are going to be doing in the future with this data is looking at how signers from the different cohorts comprehend one another's utterances. How reliable are these different devices to people who might be using different devices? So if I'm somebody who uses, say, a case marker, can someone who's primarily using agreement understand that? And so I will end there. I want to thank you all for your time and urge you all to stay safe. And of course, I want to thank everybody in my lab who has continued to find ways to create and use new data. This is just one example of that. All right, thanks.
Thank you so much, Jessie. Very cool work. Next up, we're going to hear from Leah Somerville.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great, thanks. So today I want to take the opportunity to tell you about a project that's been going on in my lab for years that I've never had the occasion to share in a forum like this, which is called the Human Connectome Project in Development. And rather than being a full harvest of this, I'd like to give more of a progress report. So just a bit of history on this project, and then I'll talk about the progress we've made and a couple of initial discoveries. The journey looks something like this. In 2015, we received funding for this large-scale project from the NIH. So we have our seeds. We started planting our seeds in 2016 when we started collecting data. And believe it or not, we continue to be collecting data till now with an appropriate pause for COVID. And so the project has continued to grow over this entire several years period of time. Now that we're close to the apex of the project, we have started to look at some very early harvests, identifying certain initial findings and focusing in on areas that we're especially interested in my group, conducting some new data analyses that I would like to mention to you today. And then finally, recognizing that the full harvest of this project is yet to come, and maybe some of you might be interested in being part of it. This project is a national study that's taking place at 4 universities across the US. And I want to give a quick shout out to my co-PI here at Harvard, Randy Buckner. And the project is focused on charting out brain development in new ways in a large cohort of individuals aged 5 to 21. This project aims to test over 13,000 different unique people, some of whom are tested multiple times, creating somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,750 data sets once all is said and done. The scientific aims of the project, there's sort of many. I'll focus in on some of the most central ones. Firstly, to characterize what healthy development looks like with a particular focus on brain networks. And then we also hope to link these changes we observe in brain networks across development with the co-occurring changes in behaviors and experiences that individuals have, as further modified by stable traits that individuals hold. Importantly, this project is collecting data that reflects youth in the United States today with respect to gender, race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. So this is not a convenient sample. This is a painstakingly collected sample instead. We've also kind of embedded certain focus areas of study within the bigger study that are of particular interest to some of the PIs or research groups that are part of this project. And I'll mention one of them today that I'm especially interested in, focusing on hormonal changes of puberty. And then finally, I just want to point out that this project is meant to be very much in the open science philosophy. The data will all be made public. In fact, some of it already has been. And the tools that we are developing as part of this project will as well. And I mention this because the data we're actually collecting in this project is massively multi-purpose, and may in fact be interesting even to some of you who aren't even necessarily interested in brain development per se, or might not want to work with the neuroscientific level of analysis. There's a lot of data here that might interest many of you for your own reasons, and that's how we designed the project, to try to keep it as relevant and useful to as many scientists as possible. So with that in mind, I might try to pique your interest right now by just giving you a flavor for the kinds of data that we are collecting in this project. So for one, we're trying to get an intricate characterization of brain development at many modalities and levels. This includes the development of brain structure, function, resting state connectivity, structural connectivity of white matter, cerebral blood flow, and the list goes on. We're collecting biological samples, including saliva and hair, to try and capture an accurate representation of hormonal puberty as it is unfolding across our sample. This is paired with markers of somatic development, which are the typical kind of measurement that's taken, and we're pairing that with active collection of hormones. We're also acquiring genetic samples on these individuals through blood, which permits both genotyping and epigenetic analyses. And we're pairing these kind of biologically based measures with a number of measures of psychological development and functioning. This includes a full clinical interview for psychopathology, measures of cognitive, linguistic, emotional, social, sensory, motor, and physical development. If you want to know if your most interesting domain is in there, it probably is, but the papers below outline exactly what is included. And we also have a number of experiential measures we're collecting to try and characterize experiences that may shape or modify brain development. These include exposure to languages at different ages, exposure to adversity, drug and alcohol use, family structure and changes and stability, behaviors around sleep, use of screens and other things. And then finally, the youth participant isn't the only participant in this study. They actually co-participate with a parent or guardian who provides almost as much data as the child does, minus the imaging session, about their own functioning behaviors and experiences, allowing tandem analyses of both parent and guardian and child. So I want to emphasize this is a really major effort. We've been working hard on this for years, in fact, and just a back of the envelope calculation in which each participant takes about 8 hours to acquire these data, takes something on the order of over 30,000 researcher hours to actually produce this data set. So big props go out to those who are on the ground doing this work day to day. The exciting news is we are almost done collecting data now. Thanks, Matt. I see him clapping. That's how I feel. Delay of gratification has been rough on this project. The green sections are those data points we have successfully acquired, and the blue is what remains. And for the most part, we are nearing completion, and we were poised to complete this fall, but COVID threw a bit of a wrench into that, although we are resuming this project any day. So in the last couple of minutes I want to give you some information about the kind of focus areas that my group is especially interested in using these data for. And we've, given that we now have over 1,200 sessions available, we have started analyses on them. So the first one is, I alluded to earlier, aiming to utilize our design to distinguish pubertal and hormonal linked versus age linked mechanisms that underlie neurodevelopment during the adolescent transition. Now, typically, puberty and age link together, right? They're correlated with one another, but they're not perfectly correlated. So many studies don't have the ability to distinguish between them in an analysis, but our study, given the sheer size, as well as a longitudinal study that's tracking people as they progress through the pubertal transition, I'm hoping and I'm confident will allow us to actually distinguish these mechanisms. So just to give you a sense of what this looks like, this is plotting just a simple summary score on self-reported somatic development. So development of body changes with puberty. This does not incorporate the hormone measures yet. And you can see a bunch of things here. First of all, puberty unfolds during the age range that we collected, which is a relief, and we obviously expected that, but we're glad to see it. We can also see that males and females diverge during certain points of time, but more or less end up in the same spot. You can also see great amounts of variability across individuals who are plotted each as a dot on this graph. Now, our longitudinal study that zooms in on this pubertal transition is focused on the ages that are highlighted here in this box. And so I think we're really eager to complete data collection because that will be the point at which we can assay all of our hormone samples and begin to undertake this analytic work. A second focus area of our group is being spearheaded by my postdoc, Graham Baum, who is very interested in brain structural development, particularly in the development of myelination. Graham is using metrics derived from brain imaging that are thought to represent gray matter myelin, and asking, first of all, when and where does its major developmental window occur, and how may it be associated with gains in cognitive domains. Very, very quickly, because I'm running out of time, I'll show you this initial finding in 632 youth. The brighter colors indicate the topography of where this metric of myelin is most yoked to age in terms of its change profile. So you can think of the reddish areas as ones that are the most predicted by increasing age. Gray matter myelin is changing all over, but these are the ones that are the most age linked, with other regions perhaps linked to other putative mechanisms. We can also split the brain up a priori into networks, which are color-coded here, and identify the sort of age-related trajectories of change, which show some interesting variability across networks, which I'm happy to talk about in more detail when there's more time. The third and final focus area of our group I'd like to highlight today is through the work of our research scientist, John Flournoy, who is interested in developing methods that will allow us to take an age-related pattern of change like this, which has a sort of active period and then a sort of plateau-y looking period, and actually quantify what parts of this curve are showing this steeper growth that is credibly different than areas that are showing more plateauing or a waning of developmental change. And he's developed a tool to do this, taking advantage of derivative metrics as well as Bayesian frameworks in order to quantitate that. So I hope to return soon and provide a fuller harvest of this project. If you're interested in harvesting something of your own, let me know. And I'd just like to end by thanking the many, many members of our team, past and present, whose work without which would not make this project impossible. Many of the alumni who are no longer in the lab have moved on to very exciting new beginnings for themselves. And I want to acknowledge my current team, who's shown a lot of resilience during this difficult period. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Leah. And thanks for the offer to share all of those wonderfully harvested data. I hope people will take you up on it. We are now at the last talk of the day. Last but not least, we're going to hear from Josh Green.
Okay, hello. Let me try this. Are you seeing my full screen? Thumbs up?
Yes,
yep.
We can see you and hear you. Go for it.
Okay, great. So the problem that I'm addressing needs no introduction, and so I won't give it one. What I'm interested in is what can we as psychological scientists do about it? So the work I'll be talking about today is led by the amazing Evan D. Philippus, who's really done an incredible job with this project. It's really been a heroic effort, and he's had so many great ideas. And so I'm really just extremely excited about this work. Okay, well, let me start with one idea that I think is maybe not so much on the right track. So a lot of what we hear about the partisan divide is that we need to know what the other side has to say to get out of your media bubble, listen to the other side. A couple of years ago, Bale and colleagues took this idea to heart, and they paid people to follow tweets from the political opposition. And the question was, if you hear what the other side has to say, will that perhaps make you a little bit more amenable to their point of view? And what they found, surprisingly and disappointingly, is that especially for conservatives, this approach seemed to backfire. That is, the more they heard from the other side, the less open they were to what the other side had to say. And you know, it's possible, I think that things like this maybe can work, but I suspect that this informational approach is not really getting to the heart of the problem. So what is the heart of the problem? I think, not alone in this, but not everybody agrees that the political turmoil that we're experiencing now has deep economic and cultural roots. Going back decades, the size of the American pie, so to speak, economic productivity has gone up and up and up, but a typical person's slice of that pie has been stagnant, and for some groups it's even gone down. The most especially hard hit have been people without college degrees. And there is a general sense of resentment and a lack of respect and a feeling of devaluing where the people who feel that they've been left behind by what America has become. Of course, it's not just Trump supporters who feel this way. If you look at the wealth gap based on race, there is cause for resentment on both sides. But I'm going to be focusing specifically, well, on both sides, but especially the views of Trump supporters. So I view this as a problem of restoring and expanding.
Josh, your voice cut out.
And in the social sciences, the idea that
Josh, you keep cutting out.
And our new approach is a game that we've created called Red Brain, Blue Brain. So the way this online quiz game works is we have Republicans and Democrats who are recruited through MTurk, but then they're brought to our custom game platform. And this is not a kind of quick MTurk survey. The people are connected, and they're playing this game in an interactive way for about 60 minutes. So the way it works is, in the interesting mixed condition, they're paired with an outgroup partner. So they do a little get to know you exercise, which among other things reveals their political identity. So people know who they're partnered with, and they're connected to they're connected with each other through a chat box. In the control condition, you're connected to somebody who shares your political views. In the interesting case, your partner is from the other side. And so you do this quiz game where you earn money for correct answers. The partners are in the same boat. They have the same winnings. They are playing truly as a team. And as you'll see when I describe in detail, the game is designed for increasing interdependence with mutual benefit. And specifically, it's done in a way that makes your political tribal identity salient and central. So it's not just that they're playing some game, but they're playing a game as a member of their political group. Although that's not made explicit, they pretty quickly figure out that that is what's going on, at least by the end. So we've done 3 experiments with this, and I'm just going to show you results from our most recent experiment, which is our big one, which is a pre-registered design with over 600 participants. Again, the idea that cooperative contact between groups can be beneficial is certainly not new. It has a lot of support, although also a lot of criticism. 2 important things I want to highlight in terms of what's new.
Josh, you're cutting out again.
It is fun to watch Josh when he's talking.
The thing about this, as I'll mention later, is that this is anonymous and automated and in principle scalable. And to us, this is very exciting. Okay, so the game proceeds in 3 stages, 3 different rounds. So the first round of the game, you get these sort of relatively easy, innocuous questions. You know, Mount Rushmore is in what U.S. state? And the people chat and they say, I think it's North Dakota. Well, I think it's South Dakota. Okay, I'll trust you. And then they move on to round 2. The idea with round 1 is that they just learn to like the game and to like each other, and it sort of eases them in. And then with round 2, we, through great research efforts on Evan's part, found questions where they're not about politics, but they're questions where liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats are likely to have different cultural knowledge bases. So based on who you tend to be, not all of you, probably relatively few of you know the name of the family on the show Duck Dynasty, since you are mostly liberals. The answer is Robertson, in case you were wondering. But you're more likely to know the name of the girl, the main character on the show Stranger Things, which, as many of you probably know, is 11. And then finally, in the third phase, we get to questions that are not exactly political, but that have a strong political component. So questions like this: what percentage of gun deaths in 2016 were caused by assault-style rifles? And liberals tend to think that this answer is really high, maybe 30 or 50%, whereas conservatives are more likely to say that it's 1 or 2%. So here's an example, and this shows you the kind of chat interface of a liberal and a conservative addressing this question about gun deaths. The right answer is 2%. So this is a question in which case the conservative intuitions are right, and you can see them debating back and forth. So the liberal says, oh, it's got to be a big number. No, I remember it being small, maybe 2%. But what about mass shootings? That's a small percentage of gun deaths. Okay, I'll put 2% and 35% as my private answer. So we're agreeing on 2%, and oh, nice, you were right. So here we have a liberal cheering because a conservative knew the right answer to this question about gun deaths. And so this is the kind of dynamic that we're trying to create. Okay, so what does having this intertribal cooperative experience where politics and identity is very salient do? One of the things we did was we used a standard feeling thermometer, which is a standard kind of political science measure of affective polarization or sort of animosity towards the other side. How warm or cold do you feel? So first, let's look at the Democrats. The dotted line are the people who had an in-group partner, so that's the control. And then you can see for the people who were paired with a Republican with an out-group partner, the feeling thermometer goes way up. They don't feel completely warmly on a scale of 0 to 100, but a significant increase in warmth. This would be like the equivalent of rolling back 20 years. This puts us back sort of at the 90s in terms of the level of political animosity. Of course, that fades over time. We have a one-day follow-up. It's faded a bit, and a week after, and still at a month after, this difference is actually significant, and by 4 months, no longer significant, but nevertheless, a pretty long effect there. And for the Republicans, we see the same kind of jump up. And actually, after 4 months, you can still detect a difference in this feeling thermometer measure of how they feel as a result of having had this experience with an outgroup member. We also used economic measures. So you can divide $100 between a random in-group member and a random out-group member, so Democrat and Republican. And the question is, how do you want to divide that up? And then this was a real decision. People were randomly selected to have their decisions implemented. And if you look at the Democrats, we only did this with the after, so you won't see the jump up. At 1 month, we still see strong effects of Democrats giving more money than otherwise to a random Republican, and then this is mostly gone at 4 months for the Democrats. But to my amazement and Evan's amazement, even at 4 months with the Republicans, you still see a significant difference in how they would allocate money between an out-group member and an in-group member who they don't know. And with the prior set of results and with the current set of results, we found that these effects seem to be moderated only for the mixed groups, which is what we would predict, by people reporting that they enjoyed the game, that they felt successful. I respected my partner respected me. I valued my partner valued me. And that seems to be what's driving this effect. And if you look at their comments, it really is heartening. So this is a Republican. These are all comments from mixed group pairs, red indicating this is a Republican. I love this experiment. Gives me hope that we can work together no matter what divides us. I loved it, made a new friend, eye-opening, fun as heck. And then this is my favorite one. I enjoyed the fun out of this experiment, possibly the coolest one I've ever done out of my 11,000 total. Bravo, folks, bravo. Thank you. In the run-up to the 2016 election and ever since, the Russian government has had a field day dividing Americans with posts on social media designed to foment animosity. And this has been incredible bang for the buck for Putin at very low cost, influencing millions of people's attitudes in a way that undermines American democracy. And my hope is that something like Red Brain, Blue Brain can be the opposite of a Russian troll farm. That is that we're hoping to turn this game into an app, and that this can be a scalable method for spreading trust and respect and goodwill. And more broadly, I think that the underlying principles here have policy implications for real world labor. That is, if we really are serious about trying to undo the damage that's been done over the last few decades, it's going to require a way of getting Americans to work together and feel like we're all really part of the same team. How do we rewrite the social contract so that everybody benefits and so that it's more inclusive than it ever has been before? That's the goal. And I think this research gives us a little glimmer of hope about how that can work moving forward. So I just wanted to say again, my great admiration for Evan leading this project and the heroic efforts he's made and the great ideas that he's had. Kirsten Brody for help, especially with our lab manager for help with the follow-up data, Beyond Conflict for supporting this research, and my lab, and also a lot of comments from Cushman Lab and others who've attended our joint lab meeting, and input from Meena Chikara. Thanks to all of you, and thanks for a wonderful Harvest Day. It's been great as always.
Great, thank you so much, Josh, for that presentation. Thanks to all of our presenters and attendees. I just want to end by saying, wow, wow, wow. I'm so glad we did this. I don't know about you, it was a lot of fun. I apologize we went over a little bit. Part of that is it's hard to cut off people virtually, but the other part, the larger part, is I didn't want to cut people off because the work is so interesting. And I've been hungry for this kind of interaction, and it's been so fun and so interesting and inspiring to see all of these presentations. Thank you once again to all of our presenters. Thanks to our organizers, Casey and Joan and Krista and team. Thanks to everyone who attended. Please do reach out to our presenters, labs, collaborators. This day often is a great day of presentations, but then a blossoming of collaborations and interactions and new projects. So I hope that will happen in this case. Thank you all so much for attending. Great to see all of you. Have a great weekend.